Okay, we're live. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Saturday Free School. Today, we're going to talk about, we're going to continue our discussion on the crisis of the ruling elite of this country. And we're going to talk about the stage of democracy today. And I think we're going to begin our discussion by talking about the recent meeting between Trump and Putin. And later today, we're going to talk about this recent podcast, which talks about the stage of democracy and what we have to learn from it. So I'll ask Doc to begin the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Simberto. Good morning to everybody. First, just a few words about the Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska. We don't have to say a lot about that because we've been talking about it for some time. I kind of agree with most of the commentary that Putin came prepared, and he does have the upper hand because he is winning. The Russians are winning militarily, and this is the last opportunity for the West, and certainly for the Trump administration, to come to terms with the fact that the war has been lost. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent, and Russia will come out of it stronger economically, militarily, and otherwise than they were when they went into the war. And at another level, Trump is clearly attempting to normalize relations with Russia, to establish a détente, and he goes about this over the heads of the Western military alliance, NATO, and of a good part of the American ruling elite. When you read the elite press and the elite's response to this, it is very clear, because they're like telling on themselves, that this war was not about Ukraine. It was really about bringing down Russia, and that, the sanctions and all of the military aid is really to bring down the Putin government and to bring about a what they call a color revolution, a regime change, and it failed. And it failed because the world had drastically changed since these wars in Western Asia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and so on. Then, of course, Russia is not as weak as Iraq was, not as weak as Syria and the other Arab nations are. And then there is what they call the global South, the BRICS nations, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and just a world that's not going to tolerate this type or that type of American hegemonism. So it's what happened, I don't think there's anything we have to go into in any deep sense. But today we want to talk about democracy and the struggle for democracy, and contrast it with a podcast by Ross Douthat. How do you say his name? Douthat. With a guy named Osita Nwanevu.
An Igbo name.
Pardon me?
It's an Igbo name.
It's an Igbo name.
Sorry.
Igbo. So he is Nigerian. Very interesting. He was born here, but his parents are from Nigeria. And I want to talk about him and the structure, the discursive structure of his arguments and the assumptions that he proceeds from. First of all, certain things, the U.S. ruling class or ruling elite cannot rule democratically anymore.
Mm.
Some decades ago, there was an elite capture of the state, and gradually the political structures, the government, the state, moved further and further away from the people, and the aspirations, desires, and needs of the people. So much so that we end up where increasingly the people have distanced themselves from the institutions of, quote, democracy, or from the state, or from politicians, or from the government. There is a wide separation between the state and the government. They're not the same, but for the sake of this level of conversation, we will say they are. On the one side, you have the state, you have the major governmental institutions, etc. And on the other side, you have the people. And this is the result of events that happened many decades ago. I usually start with the 1960s and the decade of assassinations. It is no small matter that all of these assassinations took place. You all, I am certain, are unable, maybe, I guess you can somehow imagine it, but you cannot experience the emotional impact of the assassination of the president, the assassination of the greatest people's leader in the modern history of the country, and then Malcolm X, Robert F. Kennedy, and many others. The state acted to preserve itself at the expense of democracy and of the people. Let us not underestimate this. These assassinations were a direct assault upon democracy itself. The coups constituted, as I will call it, an elite capture of the state, leading to what is in effect these days a kleptocracy, a state that exists and is controlled, I should say, by people who use the state to enrich themselves. Kleptocracy, klept is from the Greek word meaning theft. People who benefit from the state, the small group, cannot relinquish that power and return it to the people. It's too much money to be lost. I just want to repeat what I consider the five categories of crisis. Deindustrialization. Now, Trump calls himself reversing this by economic and tax policies that will encourage, and tariff policies that will encourage investment in the United States. That is by no means a deindustrialization, a reindustrialization process. What we are left with is the result of 40 years of shutting down factories, shutting down industries, and sending industries to foreign countries where labor is cheaper, or where American corporations got deals with the governments or the governments of nations that they were investing in. In China, it was a specific type of deal made where you would have industrial zones that were governed in a different way than the rest of the country. And American companies like auto companies, Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, of course, the famous one is Apple, but many, many more. They fled the country and went to China where labor was cheaper. This was the case with Mexico, where the auto industry abandoned Detroit in particular and moved to Mexico. This is why the North American Free Trade Agreement is so devastating to the working class. And then there was, all the Central American countries where the United States installed repressive regimes, fought against democratic movements like in El Salvador, of course, Nicaragua, because they wanted to preserve these Central American countries as areas of investment of large corporations because of cheap labor. You attack a democratic people's movement because you don't want people to have rights, because you want to use them as cheap labor. This was the case with the Philippines, and we can go all around the globe. This was an unbelievable process, and therefore we're going to have to, revisit North Philadelphia and Philadelphia and look at the ravages of deindustrialization, both in looking at the factories that have been abandoned. Maybe I can tell you a little bit of the biographies of various factories, and I look at them sometime almost in human terms. This factory, let us say at, I'm just off the top of my head, let's say it somewhere around 22nd and Allegheny, or this factory at somewhere else. And it's standing there, and it has been abandoned for decades. And I imagine, what does that factory feel like that was once alive with people and machinery, and now it is dead? Maybe its ghost still hovers within its factory floors. Does it remember the workers who worked there and cared for it? It was just that brutal and sudden. There was no discussion, no democratic discussion whatsoever. The unions, for all kind of reasons, I want to come back to them. The unions abdicated, and rather than organize or fight deindustrialization, they went to politics and supporting the Democratic Party, which was a central part of it. So deindustrialization and the growing economic and social inequality of the country. Deindustrialization killed neighborhoods, killed cities, killed small towns, and not just Butler, Pennsylvania. I'm talking about Jackson, Mississippi. I'm talking about Birmingham, Alabama, the central industrial city in the South. In fact, there's a very important sociological study by Horace Mann Bond, first Black president of Lincoln University, a sociologist who wrote the book Education in Alabama. And this is the important subtitle: A Study in Cotton and Steel. Very important. Deindustrialization collapsed the society. This is a profound sociological question, not yet fully studied. If there's a rise in the murder rate and of other violence and antisocial activity, the autopsy can be put at the feet of deindustrialization. So as the economy was deindustrialized, there was this increase in police funding. And so right in the middle of deindustrialization, you get the Clinton administration, which passes the NAFTA Act, which was stabbing the labor movement in the heart, and labor leaders still encourage their members to vote for them. I mean, come on. I mean, what kind of traitors are you? But at the same time that Clinton is being called by Toni Morrison our first Black president, I mean, the insult was so great by a leading African-American intellectual, so reckless, irresponsible. What are you saying to Black people? You know, but anyway, he was called the first Black president. He was supposed to be cool. He was supposed to be handsome. They're all supposed to be handsome, I guess. In 1994, in the throes of deindustrialization, the Clinton administration, along with a Democratic majority in the House and Senate, passes the Crime and Anti-Terrorism Act, which is one of the most repressive and brutal bills in the history of, quote, Western democracies, which ends up having 30% of young Black men either in prison or under the control of the criminal justice system. No one had ever seen anything like this. The nation became economically and socially divided. Black folk, the principal force for democracy in this country, will return to that when we talk about Osita and his book, were left in a state of shock without leadership that could address these problems, with the idea that we had gone from protests, i.e. King and the civil rights movement, to politics, i.e. electing Black people to mayors and Congress and Senate and so on. And every time a Black mayor is elected, oh my God, our first Black mayor. Oh my God, our first Black senator. As though these were great victories for the struggle for Black liberation, when in fact they were part of the consolidation of a regime of poverty and disenfranchisement. By disenfranchisement, I'm talking about you got the right to vote, but it makes no difference because the people you voted for are going to do whatever they want anyway. You are effectively disenfranchised. The vote is a formality that leaves you out at the end of the day. Deindustrialization. We want to really talk more about this, and we want to do more sociology. And the reason I say sociology, because it's different than political economy or economics. And I just want to make this, I want to hammer this, because most left liberals or liberals who are to the left of the center and social democrats that are pretty much the same thing, most of them do economic analysis and very few of them do sociological analysis. What is the human cost and what is the human potential to oppose these things? That is why the Free School has paid all of this attention to Black folk, their churches, their gods, their social institutions, because Black folk, going back to the anti-slavery struggle, have been the key and most consistent democratic force in this country. So sociology will be very important. The second is the cost of empire. This cannot be underestimated or overestimated. The cost of the American empire, that is, just to give a graphic of it, 800 military bases around the world. An entire decade and a half from the early 2000s until 2015, 2016 of wars in Western Asia, what they call the Middle East, which it is estimated cost the nation $7 trillion in a matter of 15 years. So the cost of empire accounts for the major part of the sovereign debt. By sovereign debt, again, we mean the debt of the federal government, which is now $37 trillion. And thank you, Shanti, for getting me straight on this, upon a GDP or national economy that is about $30 trillion. So the debt is $7 trillion more than the GDP. However, the GDP is already inflated. So that's why, we talk about this purchasing power parity. See, the numbers in terms of how large the economy is are based upon inflationary numbers. Okay? So it looks like the economy is growing in substance when in fact it is growing essentially by inflation. So it looks larger than it really is. But nonetheless, to keep the government going, to support an empire, to support wars, the government has had to constantly borrow, and increasingly from foreign countries like China, like Japan, like Saudi Arabia, and large hedge funds and other financial institutions in this and other societies, leading to this $37 trillion, 1.25 times the size of the gross domestic product. Were it not, and I won't go into all of you'll just take this as a given, were it not for the privileged position of the dollar as the global reserve currency, the debt would be larger because there would be fewer nations and institutions who would want to borrow. The devaluation of the dollar would be rapid, and so on. It is only because governments throughout the world, in order to carry out trade amongst themselves, need dollars. That is the currency of trade between nations, or the ways that nations value their currency. So if Mexico trades with Brazil, they don't do it in pesos or whatever the Brazilian currency is. They do it in dollars, or they do it in dollar-denominated currencies. In other words, Brazil and Mexico, to do trade, it must be mediated through the US dollar, which means that all nations must have dollars in their central banks, which means that they must buy dollars, which means that props the dollar up and prevents it from being devalued. Okay? And well, this goes back to 1971 when the United States went off the gold standard. But to put it in stark terms, the U.S. has pimped the system. And much of this has been to support U.S. empire. So this 37, soon to be, I don't know how long, 50 trillion Sovereign debt is the cost of empire. Let's keep it 100. It's not the cost of Social Security or Medicare. The cost of empire. The cost of empire and deindustrialization are like a toxic mix of factors that produce the devastation of the American nation, American population, the American cities that we see every day. And we're going to see it more here in Philadelphia as SEPTA cuts back on routes, raises fares, and makes it more difficult for people to get to work, to go shopping, to do whatever, their children to get to school. The third thing is the crisis of governance. How can a government govern people who see the government as illegitimate? This is a huge crisis, especially if you claim to be a democracy and if you claim that people's votes count and can make a difference. A crisis of legitimacy is a crisis of trust. As poverty rises, and by the way, governments at every level are lying about the levels of violence. Like they say, oh, crime is down by 25%. Well, you go ask any Philadelphian, especially a Black Philadelphian living in a poor neighborhood, do you feel safer? And you would get almost unanimously, no, I do not. And they don't. And they're not. But they lie about inflation. They lie about everything practically. And the people no longer trust them. They don't believe them. Crisis of government. The ruling elite, the political class, the Black misleadership class can no longer govern with the consent of the people. This is a crisis of democracy, a crisis of legitimacy. It is a crisis of trust. Unlike anything we have ever seen. For this reason, people like Colonel McGregor, who says the current situation in the United States looks something like 1789 in Paris. That is, that the uprising that led to the overthrowing of the monarchy. Others openly say, you know, we're looking at a potential civil war in this country. We've discussed all of this so much in the free school. Civil wars or revolutions occur when people no longer feel that they have a say in the way they're governed. You know? Then there's the moral and civilization crisis. I put the two of them together. Probably should say the civilization and moral crisis. And you know, this is being talked about everywhere you look, in the New York Times, in the Financial Times, in this journal, in this podcast. It's all over the place. Probably the reason for existence of David Brooks and Ross Douthat and others, as I say, their raison d'etre is to draw attention to the depth of the civilization crisis. The country has reached a point of moral and almost civilizational collapse. And the last is the crisis of knowledge and science. where, and I'll just put it this way, with so much of what we call science is just mere propaganda. Scientists solve very few problems, if any. They just talk about how great they are and how much they're doing. You know, and you really see the nature of this crisis when you, for instance, compare the numbers of scientific essays produced by Chinese universities as compared to American universities. Of the top 10 universities where the faculty and researchers are most productive and are publishing, the top 10, out of the top 10, 8 or 7 are Chinese. Universities are autocratically, dictatorially run. They are places where whenever you see a tenured professor, you're looking at a bootlicker, an ass kisser, who licked boots and kissed ass for 6 or 7 years, and then the senior faculty say, "This is a good slave, I am." There's nothing to them. Well, you all have gone to universities, you all are still, and you know, you learn more in 1 month in free school than you do in 4 or 5 years at these universities. That's, you know, and then you get to the social sciences. It's a complete joke. There is no sociology, and so on. So those are the 5 areas of crisis, and when you put them all together, it makes sense that you see a general crisis of the system. But then what is the answer to a crisis? How do you resolve a crisis? You know, and this is the big question, and this is the question upon which free school operates. Not just to have a podcast and talk about what's going on, but to talk about how to resolve such a crisis. Our answer has always been a democratic one. I want to explain this because free school differs profoundly from the position of the far or ultra left, who in the face of a crisis always say, well, the answer is socialism. And who will lead the country to socialism? The communists. I put quotes around that. That's the far left answer. Then you get the liberal and social democratic answer. How do you answer the question? By reforming the structures, political structures of rule that the people have already said they don't trust. So we will reform them, we will restructure them, we will do things such as limiting or eliminating the electoral college. We will do things such as limiting or eliminating the Senate, which is viewed as undemocratic because California with 40-some million has as many senators as Delaware or Rhode Island, these small states. And that is seen as a democratic imbalance. What we are talking about and is close, if not identical, to what King and Du Bois and the Black Freedom Movement have put forward. I think it is so important that as we think about this moment in the future, that we continue to reference this great revolutionary movement that was led by Black people. Most liberals, almost all liberals, all ultra-leftists, all social democrats, they have one thing in common. They minimize the Third American Revolution. It is not a revolution. It was a reform movement led by good-meaning, though reformist Black people like Martin Luther King. Anybody that knows about that period feels a deep, I know I do, a deep sense of insult. Because mainly it is white people that make these claims. It's more difficult for Black people, even the ones that sell out, to make that claim and still want to garner support from Black people. Because most Black people don't see it that way. They see it as a great moment of sacrifice in the interest not only of Black people, but the nation. Most Black people, and here I'm not talking about those who make a big deal of Black August. If you want, you can ask me questions about that. That is some ultra-left Black Liberation Army opposition to the Civil Rights Movement. You say, Tony, how do you know that? Because I know the people involved. I know where you come from. I know where you live. When I say know where you live, the ideological house that you live in. That's part of that's part of the terrain that I lived in, that I fought in, that I struggled in, And when they come with all this Black August, I don't want nobody to be in jail for 40 and 50 years. You know what I'm saying? But some ways you put yourself there. Your reckless tactics in the name of armed struggle. Now, again, just for the sake of transparency, as I always say, when I was 19, 20 years old, I believed that the answer to the problem of Black oppression was insurrectionary violence. I believed in that, So I'm not unsympathetic to people of my generation who maybe took it further than I did, and so on. Those elements remain committed to a non-democratic, struggle position vis-a-vis democratic change. In fact, they do not see democracy as the objective of the first stage of any revolutionary process. In other words, I don't care whether it's Vietnam, Korea, China, Ghana, South Africa. There is no revolution that does not first call for the seizure of power by the people. That is democracy. Reconstruction. I laugh because I'm thinking about all these people that claim to understand Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. Sometimes I just feel that it is trivializing probably one of the great studies of democracy. What Du Bois was talking about when he talks about the dictatorship of the Black proletariat, when he talks about abolition democracy, which he does not talk about as much as he talks about the dictatorship of the Black proletariat. What he was talking about when he understood Reconstruction was rebuilding the South from the ruins of slavery and the Civil War to be the major center of democracy in the whole nation. The counter-revolution against Reconstruction threw it back to becoming the most reactionary and racist part of the country, when the potential was for it to become the most democratic part of the country. Under the democratic dictatorship of the Black proletariat. That's what he's saying in the book. You don't get that, you're not reading the book. And thus it is King who goes from Douglass and the anti-slavery struggle through Du Bois to, and I like to put it like this, from the anti-slavery to the anti-imperialist struggle. This is the historical trajectory that we are looking at. You don't see that. You ain't looking at American history, and you definitely don't want to look at Black people and their agency. So if you default to, let us say, the Marxist interpretation of Europe in the 19th century, you cannot understand anything about American history. We are talking about a democratic struggle of the people, by the people, and for the people. The crisis that the country faces, indicated in these 5 things that I mentioned, can only be resolved not by a new elite, but by a democratic seizure of power by the people. If you recall our discussions with James Lawson, a direct participant in and theorist of the Black freedom movement, and we got to that point in our discussion where we were talking about, does the nonviolent theory have a theory of seizing state power? And we talked about Mao, we talked about Lenin, I think we mentioned the Cuban Revolution. And he said, in effect, we do not have a full-blown theory. But I think he said, but he would think that a popular movement based upon nonviolent resistance and non-cooperation could create a crisis of such magnitude that the ruling elite would have to either concede completely or come to terms in a compromise with the democratic movement. This is a democratic solution to an anti-democratic problem. Once you appeal to the people, you are appealing on the basis of democracy. Because what is democracy? Rule of the people. Once that appeal is made, you say you have committed yourself to a democratic process to end the rule of anti-democratic forces. Well, that's what free school does. To achieve that demands a political and ideological education and discussion among people, to know the people, to respect the people. If you think that, free school is violating the Marxist idea that religion is the opiate of the people, I guess we are. But if you find that offensive, I'd like to ask you, well, how do you get to know Black people? How do you know them? How do you know their aspirations? Or do you even care? And this is the insult upon injury. The insult upon injury to a great people whose contribution to world history is unequaled in this society. And they don't exist for you. They don't make a difference for you. Well, that is a default to white supremacy in its worst form. To call oneself a revolutionary or progressive and not even at the most superficial level understand this indicates, whether you're fully conscious of it or not, that you have made a choice to reform the white supremacist social system rather than to demolish it. You know, this is why, you know, just examples. At Lucian Blackwell Library, a site of democratic discourse among and with the Black proletariat. This is the way it happens. You talk to James Lawson. We were at Fisk University. We began to have meetings with students, discussion. And we agreed that we, students and so on at Fisk, would have to take on the racist establishment in Nashville. And they did. But that's democracy. Martin Luther King. You know, you can never say enough about Martin Luther King. Of course he was a genius. Of course. This is not they don't even say he's a genius. There's no John Kennedy, come on, man, you're talking about adolescence compared to a grown man, you know, a child who could perform but had not the depth of substance. King is a genius. Any nation would be proud to call him a citizen or a leader of their nation. Any nation. He was world transformative. The world thought differently about itself after Martin Luther King, and the world is still thinking about itself through the eyes of Martin Luther King. And that's part of what we're trying to do. What did he see? Oh, I'm sorry, John.
That's why he was assassinated.
Absolutely. But they assassinated his body, but not his spirit. He lives. His impact is so powerful. You know, I guess I've said this before. You know, I'm 17, 18 years old. I want to get this thing over with. I want us to be free tomorrow. Why is it taking so long? You know, not thinking about my grandparents, how long had they been on the battlefield? You know, but I'm 17. I want to get it done. We're going to do it in a year. You know what I'm saying? And frankly, I distrusted King because I thought he was too perfect. You know? And what revolutionary that I had ever seen was wearing a suit and tie? Well, I didn't know too much. I was thinking about Mao Zedong and Fidel and them. But he wore a suit and tie. What revolutionary had ever been a preacher? And who had been so perfect, so rhetorically impeccable? You listen to those speeches. They are flawless in their logic, in their use of language. Where did he learn all this language? You know, all of this poetry, all of this philosophy, and then at the same time going to jail repeatedly to overturn an unjust system. I don't know that there are many people you could compare to him. He fulfilled in real life Gandhi's prediction to the Thermans. It will be through your people that my message will be known to the world. He was almost perfection in living in a concrete body. And then he wasn't an elitist at all, a man of the people. One of Black people's many gifts to world humanity. And for that, Black people are hated by the ruling elite. For 60 years now, they've thrown everything at our people that they could. That is why the free school is absolutely right to attach our future, our theory to Black folk. Who else you going to attach it to? I don't need Karl Marx or not even Lenin or even Fidel or Mao to tell me how to conduct this struggle. We have it. We have lived it, and it's part of our DNA, of our history, of our being, of our social ontology. That's us. That is us. And it's a tremendous heritage. And Black people are a special gift, even in a time of our deepest troubles. We are a special gift. Democratic struggle demands that we start with the most advanced and consistent democratic force in this society, Black folk. You can't get around it. Unless you want to revise the writing of history towards racism. By the way, I consider all of these appeals to the class struggle to be a default towards white supremacy. You know, I mean, I think, you know, all the work we do here, it's hard to fool us because we do this every week and study the situation. You know, to the extent that I take the time, I look at all of these different socialist conferences this summer, and the Revolutionary Socialist versus the Socialist Convention, or the International Socialists versus, I don't know, but you know, they're all over the place. I look at the American Communist Party, and I'll just tell this story once again. Emily and I met with a young man, a kind of a nomad in the left. He goes from thing to thing. without any anchorage. He would come to free school, and I thought that if he were truly interested, he would made a deeper commitment. But of course, being white and being a leftist and a Marxist, he knew more than we did. Sometimes I'm like, y'all don't know no more than I do. I was in all this, you know. But I remember we met with him, and he was talking to us about his disenchantment with one of these leftist organizations. And I'm so glad I brought Emily with me. And you will recall, I said to him, look, man, you know, I don't feel any sympathy for you. You made choices. But I said, but I want you to know out the gate, I don't accept white leadership. And I said it just like that. Now, I guess it was a moment of truth, but I was just up to my neck with all of this BS. And I just said, look, man, I don't accept white leadership. So what you want me to do? You know what I'm saying? And I don't feel a whole lot of empathy for people like you who only accepts white leadership. So as they say, let's keep it 300. I do not, and I don't. Because if you ask me to accept white leadership, the first thing you have to do is show me white leadership. I don't know of any. Inconsistent, you know, talk out of both sides of your mouth and think. This is the big thing. This is the problem of the trade union movement, has been since the beginning. That we can be both for the working class and white supremacists, or don't take a position on racism. You know, like at the height of the civil rights movement, the AFL-CIO took a position where we're not getting in that because that's not a workers' struggle. No, that's not why you didn't get in it. You didn't get in it because you're white supremacists. That's why you didn't get in it and never was in it. You understand? Excuse my talking like this. That's the moral truth, the moral imperative. So if you're looking to the working class, and I put quotes around that because they don't know what the hell they're talking about. It's a working class without black people. Oh, we're talking about the working class majority. All right, now you done told me what you're all about. You're about white people. But the working class majority, quote unquote, has never been a democratic force for democratic change. And Du Bois is right in the discovery of the black proletariat as the central force of change in this society. We see it clearly in free school, at Lucian Blackwell, among other places, but we've seen it in many places that we operate in. That black people respond to ideas and to progressive change in a way that even the best white folk don't. It's just so concrete, so palpable. There is no other group with the sense of democracy and the rights of all people, true democracy. You know, I mean, it's just an extraordinary experience. Alice, see, Lucian Blackwell is what we in sociology call a case study. You know what I'm saying? she's going to do sociology in China, by the way, when she goes there. And really, I feel very grateful to Alice for saying to me, And Doc, I want to know sociology. How do you do sociology? Because I just took it for granted that everybody, especially y'all having gone to Ivy League universities, but now, okay, I should have known better. I figured y'all had at least a sociology 101 course. Isn't that deep? But anyway, you know, Lucian Blackwell is a case study. Barbara Brown, the librarian, is a case study. We have worked with great people in the free library system. I mean, wonderful people. But then when you look at the levels of consciousness, Barbara is different. You know what I'm saying? You have to convince her. She has to believe you. But once she does, you not only have a friend, and a real friend, a true friend, but an ally in struggle. I mean, there's no question about it. So it is a case study. You know, and you know, but that is the way Black folk are. Always have been. You know what I'm saying? That is what we are. So I don't know. But you get the point. But it is there that revolutionaries learn. We're not just, quote, teaching, and probably not mainly teaching. We are learning and listening. And it is so valuable for me to hear the way people talk, what they feel, what they respond to. Now, just another thing. You know, we have paid close attention to Arthur Fawcett's Black Gods in the Metropolis. I know that Serafina and Emily are dealing with the Taylor Branch 3 volumes. Both of them are hugely important because each of them, oh yes, Emily is starting with volume 3, but starting with volume 1, Sam? Yeah. It is what you call a narrative history. It is a history told through the experience of the participants in the struggle. And so his research was done in the 80s, so Diane was still, well, Diane is still alive, but John Lewis, James Lawson, and of course King and Coretta Scott King and C.T. Vivian, Ralph Abernathy, all of these participants are in these volumes. And that's better than any documentary because the way he constructs it, they live. And you know, civil rights activists are very honest people. And they trusted Taylor Branch because he was honest, you know? So he tells the story better than it's ever been told in written text. But what you see is how deeply grounded these activists and revolutionaries are in morality and Christian morality. You put these two bodies of work together, and what you see unfolding are the Black Gods. The deep belief of Black people, belief so deep that on any given day, any one of them would have given up his or her life. We have never seen anything like it in this country, where so many activists were ready to give up their lives at any time. I mean, it's just, how to explain it, how to become like that, how to learn from it, this is something that I could be like them. I consider myself just incomplete, less than. They were just, even when I was a kid looking at them, I didn't even want to go down south, let alone be in a struggle. And here they are, standing up to Nazi. You talking about Nazis? Come on, dog. Take me to jail. Oh, you going to threaten my life? This is Diane Nash. Oh, this is why Diane is just, I don't even know how. Is there anything similar to her? She is a young girl, in her 20s, and the civil rights movement said, we're going to protest segregation in buses and interstate commerce. Now, what does the interstate got to do with it? Well, first of all, the money is built with the tax dollars of Black people, among others. So it's interstate. It's the government. It ain't Mississippi highways or Alabama highways. They're federal highways. And buses will travel on those highways and be segregated. In other words, if I'm going down to South Carolina on a Greyhound or Trailways or whatever kind of bus, when we get to the nation's capital, Black people had to move to the back of the bus. Just ruthless insult of your dignity as a human. And that's another thing we have. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. And the trains too, yes. How did a people preserve their dignity in the face of this when the federal government don't do nothing? That's another study, And like Langston Hughes in his poem, What Happens to a Dream Deferred? We kind of, when we look at a lot of young people, a lot of kids, we're looking at dreams deferred. Their parents and grandparents had their dreams deferred. And the children can't even begin to dream because the parents and grandparents did not pass on to them their dreams, because the parents don't have no dreams. What happens to a dream deferred? But then we look, it's not completely deferred. We still have dreamers and imaginary. We still have it, And so we see in Taylor Branch, it would be great if we could just do, at somebody's crib once a week, we just read this aloud. You know what I'm saying? I know I read the first 2 volumes with my best friend at the time, Brenda. We read it together over the phone, and works like this should be read publicly and should be read aloud. These type of human beings have never been seen before and have not been seen since. they are Black. Revolutionary traditions in this country are disproportionately associated with Black people. There's any discussion that does not recognize that is by its very nature white supremacist. You know, we don't have to go through the data. We've repeated it over and over and over again. 70% of the people say the government does not represent them and the economic and political systems have to be reformed. 15% of the American people, as polled, say that the whole system has to be uprooted. 25% say that they don't feel that that political violence is wrong. This is a crisis. But then white people have no idea what to do. And in a lot of ways, it's on them. They could have learned from Black people easily. Too arrogant. And that's part of the crisis of whiteness. When all that you were arrogant about collapses, you ain't got no religion. You ain't got no political system. You ain't got no democracy, and you're getting poor by the day. You understand? But you want to stay white and be progressive. You want to stay white and be dem. You can't have it both. Evil can't coexist. That level of evil cannot coexist with moral integrity. I just want to go to this guy named Osita Nwanevu. Igbo, I don't know why I was associating that name with East Africa, with Malawi, but it's Bantu, and the Igbos are Bantu speakers. When y'all get a chance, it's a interview with that Ross Douthat. I just can't. I mean, I'd like to do that better, right? You know, Ross do that.
To do you.
Yeah, you do that or doing that. Yeah, I'm somehow become attached to that. Oh, I'm sorry. Say that again.
Osita Nwanevu.
Oh, yeah, Nwanevu. Osita. Very interesting. He's y'all's age.
Yeah,
33. 32. Very articulate, obviously very well educated in the white way. You know, his gesturing, his phrasing, everything is so white, it's almost embarrassing. Dog, have you ever met a Black person in your life? I mean, just everything is just so white. And he's smart as hell and young as hell. You know what I'm saying? But he has written a book, and Ross Douthat interviewed him. And this is Ross Douthat's podcast on the New York Times site. And, you know, I like to listen to Ross Douthat and David Brooks, by the way, also. And in the interview, they're talking about, well, the context. The context is Trump winning for the second time with electoral college majority and a popular majority. A complete rejection of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is in crisis, and they look to be in something of a circular firing squad. The battles, although not publicly articulated or acknowledged, it's an existential struggle for the Democratic Party. And the question is, can the Democratic Party defeat what they call the populist right? And they acknowledge, when they have enough sense to, that the Democratic Party, which was won to the Democratic Party as a result of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, and then the Black Party working class as a result of the Civil Rights Movement and the Johnson administration. So the Democratic Party always represented the majority of the working class. Today, only a minority of the working class identifies with the Democratic Party. It is a party of wokeness. It is a party of elites. It is made up of the richest people to ever have existed in the world. The income and wealth levels of those in the Democratic Party far exceed the Republican Party, which is more working class and lower middle class. And I would even say some poor people. So how does this party move forward? Now, Osita writes as a social democrat. Now, this is a very, if I might say, a very, my language, ill-defined political category. You know, you got the Democratic Socialist of America, that's the political party. And it has about, as they suggest, 16,000 members, 17,000 members, which is not a small number for left party. They have, for example, Zoran Mondani, the guy in New York, he is a self-identified social democrat. Bernie Sanders is a social democrat. Brandon Johnson, the mayor of Chicago, is a social democrat. A good part of the city council of Chicago are social democrats. You know, now, what are they? Ocasio-Cortez is a social democrat. Yeah. But social democracy is not that much different than being a left-wing liberal. A left-wing liberal is more or less like a New Deal liberal. You know, so they appear to be. So they appear to be a rebellious group within the Democratic Party, but rebelling against a neoliberal party of rule. So you're not all that, by the way, you know. And so what is their theory of democracy going forward? This is where I wanted to start with democracy. And so Osita Nwanevu writes a book that suggests a theory and practice going forward that could make the Democratic Party competitive with this large mass of disaffected, angry, working people, Black people, immigrants, Mexicans, and so on. What are you going to say? You lost them. They weren't interested in your culture war strategy. You understand what I'm saying? See, well, it was like a switcheroo, a bait and switch. Oh, we will stand up for Black people, but we're going to put trans people first. And Black people knew what you were doing. How you going to put us, you know, oh, they're the most oppressed and yada, yada, yada. Or other, identity politics. So they're going to run on a coalition of identity politics, you know. But then they lost badly and looked like they will continue to lose. But So he has a theory of democratic reform, by which he means the reform of the institutions and processes of election and governance. For example, rather than the electoral college direct vote for president. Say, well, how do you do that short of a constitutional amendment? Well, you do it by a number of states, let's say California, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and others, saying that we will enter into a pact whereby we will go around the electoral college and we will certify whoever gets the majority of votes. You know what I'm saying? And all of us maybe will constitute 40% of the electorate, maybe, I'm not certain. So it eliminates the special privilege, let's say, of a Delaware or Rhode Island or Nebraska. A number of states who by passing laws in their state go around the electoral college, okay, and will count the votes and certify winners based upon direct vote. Another thing is to reform the Senate. Senate is a very undemocratic institution. It has too much power. It was back in the days a way to protect interests that were not popular, were not the people, as it were. There's some other reforms that he suggests that I don't remember right off the top. But here is the problem. In the face of an elite capture of the institutions of power in the country undemocratically and ruling the country in undemocratic ways, how does the left within the Democratic Party inspire a liberal and not left-wing, quote unquote, rebellion that would equal the Trump populist rebellion and thus be able to take back the presidency? And that's the key. If we can split off those sections of the Trump movement that could respond to an appeal to make elections more democratic, to make the governing institutions more democratic, including the Supreme Court, you know, we will then be able to blunt the movement of this, quote, populist right. This writer that I'm talking about is a theorist of democracy in a moment of deep crisis. Mm-hmm. And this is why his physical blackness was such, you know, it's kind of causes a kind of cognitive dissonance. You're black, but you talk like a white person. I mean, not just talk, but you think like a white person. Your assumptions are the white person. How do I know that? No reference to the civil rights movement of black people. Did you notice it?
Yeah, I mean, the only time he mentions is about how democracy has changed from 1787 down to the civil rights movement.
Yes, that's all.
Yeah, total contempt for the people.
I would say so.
No, he was born in 93, so...
Oh, say that again?
He was born in 93.
Yeah.
So he's sort of our generation. Oh, sorry. We should probably go ahead.
Yeah, he was born in 1993, this young man. He's their ages. Just their same, but he's very well educated in the white way and very articulate. And he speaks, I mean, if you didn't see him, you would think a white person was talking, you know? But, you know, that's a whole nother question, a cultural assimilationist question. And by the way, probably a strategy to say, if I wish to be heard by these elites,
Right.
I must talk like I'm white. I must sound in a way that is familiar to them. Hmm? Yes, my point. And you a man, you a black man too, you got to take all the bass out of your voice. You know what I'm saying? Like when you black person, you get stopped by the police, man, you try to speak tenor. You know, get that bass out of your voice. And don't show too much emotion or passion. But is this a matter, the crisis of structural change in the institutions of government and election? Or is the question a deeper question of a democratic seizure of power by the people? And then the next question becomes, well, wouldn't it be more practical to just reform the institutions and make them more responsive to the people, rather than the longer term, harder fought civil rights strategy of a Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement? Isn't it more practical? Think about it. Most people, the people are not going to respond. You're not going to be able to get what you want. You're just a pie in the sky thinker. And therefore, let us do something that is more practical and intermediate. Change the electoral college, you know? Well, and the question for them then is, will these structural changes be adequate to really change the nature of democracy, to change power from what happened with the elite seizure going back to the 1960s? How do we overturn what was in effect a coup d'etat? How do you change that? But how can you have democracy without that type of change? How? You will get something that's a little bit different than this that we have now, but it will not be democracy. You will still have kleptocratic forces, that is, forces that use government to steal money in power. You'll still have the military-industrial complex and war in power. You still gonna have that $37-50 trillion debt based upon the cost of empire. So this writer, I mean, he really sounds appealing, and I have to confess, I had a little empathy for him because he's young and dumb.
You said he was smart earlier.
Yeah, but only, but you know, so I'm not contradicting myself.
I thought he was dumb.
No, I qualified it. I said smart in the white way.
Oh,
Yeah, which is dumb in the real way. I hate to say. So, but, hey, Jerry, you ain't no good, dog.
Good in the
Good.
bad in the
Bad in the
Yeah, but it is not enough. And at the end, people that think like him, of course, he's a part of larger networks. People that write and think like him cannot win. And I think in the long term, and not so long term, we are on the right side of history. this will not just be a matter of what the American people do, although it will essentially be what the American people do. It will be the result of world processes, as it always is the case. And finally, it will be the great Black people who will make the difference. The only force that can galvanize the people in a real struggle for democracy. And so I'll stop there. Say something. You gonna say something anyway? So,
After someone else.
no, I know.
Maybe I missed this. So his strategy is essentially to reform the electoral college, hope that essentially the people, or a good number of people, would essentially defeat the far right and put Trump into power. Is that his?
That's the immediate goal, is to diffuse the rebellion that led to Trump winning. The long term is to make the institutions of government more responsive to the population. In other words, if a person runs on universal health care or Medicare for all, don't, after you get in office, then say, well, I'm not quite for that, I'm down with Obamacare, you know? Or if the people, by polling data, show that they're against war and want a peace budget, well, how do you, to make elected officials or people, or the path to being elected, be more responsive to the people? That is the theory. And so it is changing ways that people are elected, especially presidents. But then, well, I don't know how far they. To me, it's more like pie in the sky at the end of the day.
Because like his basic, well, actually, it was interesting. It kind of like started out interesting at least, but then it just got less and less interesting as the conversation went along. Because also like the conversation starts by Douthat and this guy saying, like, basically saying that the basic premise is American society is not democratic. And that he's like, okay, so Douthat, like, what is democracy? And then he says, basically government of the people, by the people, for the people, in which assist in a society in which the
I think
people.
he was just more simple. He said it is the rule of the people.
Yes, so he uses both. He uses both examples. He
okay.
uses the Lincoln
Yeah.
term, because that comes from apparently Lincoln, and then in which a society in which the people govern.
Yes.
Which I was like, okay, cool. At least we have like basic, basic definition. And then like also like the way that they market like the interview itself is like, we need like a new constitution, like and so like abolish the Senate, all that stuff. But then like as the conversation goes on, it's like it becomes increasingly clear that this guy has no coherent worldview, because actually at one point Douthat is like, couldn't you say that Trump is an expression of democratic impulses amongst the American people? And then the Osita is like, yes. But then they started the interview by Osita saying that Trump is an expression of anti-democracy. So like he's really contradicting himself throughout the entire conversation. And so like I agree that it's essentially it just boils down to like democrat, like social democracy, and that he also kind of brings up that whole thing of like most people live a third of their lives in like the workplace, for example, and so therefore what we need is workplace democracy
and more unions
and all that stuff. And actually, interestingly, it's funny because Du Bois in various places actually does write about the need for a new constitution, and that the American Constitution as it was written is basically outdated. In terms of actually grappling with the kind of actual historical development of American society. And I think he actually has, Du Bois does write about the Senate and like kind of the disproportionality of, but interestingly, like what that would lead to is a kind of, I feel like the vision is towards like American quote unquote governance being heavily disproportionately ruled by cities, by the like most heavily urbanized parts of the country, and that essentially like the more rural parts of the country would have increasingly less say in governance. But I don't know. It's just like I feel like because like I feel like most of us were listening to the interview, and then as it went along, I was like, this guy doesn't really have anything to say.
Doesn't he say that we need to create more states in order to?
Oh yeah, it's one of the options. Okay.
Oh yeah, Puerto Rico needs got like
Oh, yeah, Puerto Rico and.
like Washington
DC.
D.C. needs representation. Yeah.
No, I mean, I wanted to say the thing you mentioned, Doc, that like who he is speaking to. Even the interview sort of, even Ross Douthat starts by saying that, ultimately the main point of this discussion even is that these radical critiques from the left are going to help the Democratic Party move forward. And yeah, I mean the whole thing sounds like an advertisement at this point of a new phase for the Democratic Party to pick up.
Yeah.
And like I was also initially, because he starts by like what Jeremiah was saying, he starts by saying that democracy is not simply a question of the political institutions, but also the economic institutions. I also thought he was going for the question of industrial democracy, but then he sort of like he really reveals himself when he says that the reason he's talking about economic democracy and so on is the way he's talking about the labor movement. And he says that the labor movement is where we should tap in, because we have we have been shown in the last election that the American people are too selfish, that they're too they're self-interested, and that's why they are going for Trump. And I mean, I think just shows a complete contempt and lack of understanding of why people voted for Trump in the first place. I mean, yes, you have a large section of people who are going to be moved by like what they call the kitchen table issues. But the thing is that this has been the movement of history where you see people are actually seeing that it is the Democratic Party who talk about these abstractions of democracy which have nothing to do with their practice. This is the way that there was a popular mandate which did bring Trump, which the Free School has been saying. But I think he really shows the kind of contempt he has for the American people. And I kind of like Ross Douthat's pushback, saying that one of the criteria for democracy is when ideas which are disreputable to the ruling class but have a lot of clout among the people, do these ideas have political power? And he doesn't have anything to respond to that with the Osita guy. So I thought it was revealing about how even how democracy is thought of in the ruling elite, for the ruling elite. What is the idea of democracy moving forward? And the other thing, this is what Emily was also mentioning, because we're talking about Sean Fain, and the fact that I think all these the social democracy champions, people like Osita and so many of the others, I think their relationship to the labor movement is ultimately responsible for the complete capture of the labor movement. And this is what also going back to what you started the discussion with about the white working class, and what are the possibilities, what role have the white working class played, and what role can it play today? And is it even a democratic force? Has it been a democratic force? And I think especially now I think one of the products of the counter-revolution has been that the working class as a whole has been, something the left talks about all the time, where it is basically, it's no longer invested in, like you were saying, in the struggle for democracy. It's become one of these.
Well, it has to be galvanized, but that's all,
Right.
On its own, it can't.
Well, 'cause one of the kind of because you also mentioned discursive strategies and the kind of ideological framework of people like this is the whole concept of workplace democracy is, when you think about it, it's very limited, because it's because Osita, he keeps bringing up this thing of like, it's workers versus the bosses, which is, I feel like it's like the kind of language that's very common in like the kind of like left circles. But it's like, if you take a city like Philadelphia, right? The most anti-democratic force, which is the University of Pennsylvania, yes, employs many people, but the way that literally the University of Pennsylvania rules the city is not really just through who it employs. It's like you have part of the crux of like what makes it such an anti-democratic force is that UPenn controls where development takes place, how development takes place. It controls like literally the fate of like entire neighborhoods of the city, but you don't have to be an employee of UPenn to be impacted by what UPenn is doing in terms of literally governing the city of Philadelphia. And I think it's like that itself is like one of the like the kind of, it's always the gesture towards like, oh, you're a worker and your primary thing is like against your bosses. When it's like also one of the consequences of deindustrialization is that like people are ruled, and it's not just through like literally the workplace that they're in, but it's also all these other forces that converge, which are like essentially like in an anti-democratic and tyrannical fashion, shaping the kind of direction of people's lives. And I don't know, I feel like that's kind of one of the tropes of the kind of leftist like social democratic thing, where it's like in that way you can also make an argument for like Starbucks workers, people who are in like marketing or whatever, like I am, and it's just about like this narrow thing of like, oh, like I want better like workplace governance in my corporation or in my company, when it's like that's not really what Americans think of when they say that American society is anti-democratic or undemocratic.
Well, because the other pairing of what you're saying is that it's a way that people misunderstand, for example, the unions in Philly. Like, let's take the Black unions, like 1199C, where back at the height, when there's still at least, even like when deindustrialization hit factories, where you still had these hospitals now employing so many Black people in their service jobs. The Black people misunderstand Henry Nicholas or 1199C, this very powerful union as just demanding increased wages. But you have to actually see, it's because we see unions today actually just only fighting for, 3% raise, 5% raise. But actually, if you go back to Henry Nicholas and 1199C, people make the mistake of not seeing that kind of union as basically putting forward a democratic demand. That this is not just about my job at Temple Hospital, but I'm demanding that the major institutions of the city that are benefiting from like my work, my community, my taxes, that you owe the people, like you owe the people something, you owe a certain level of dignity in our lives, a certain whatever. And I think it's a mistake that people make between thinking just because like 1199C workers are going to strike that it's about their contract. It's not, it's actually a democratic demand for that particular proletariat or worker. It is a democratic demand that this city ought to work for the people who actually have made it what it should. Because in some ways, that's actually the difference between even King. Like actually hearing you talk about this Osita, because actually I tried listening to it and then I stopped halfway through because I was like, I wasn't getting anything new because he's just, I actually didn't know he was a Democrat, but you can tell he's a Democrat. And it's because in a lot of ways people want to make nowadays people want to make King into a social democrat, right? They want to say, oh, he was fighting for the redistribution of wealth. He was fighting for a reform, restructuring of the existing system. But actually, it's a misunderstanding of even King's theory of democracy. King and Du Bois as theorists of democracy in a new way, where like even because King, like when we were reading the first chapter of Where Do We Go From Here? Where do we go from here? So, and where King basically says, he's like, the fact that we have a struggle that remains in the North shows something about the next stage of a democratic struggle, which is the next stage of the democratic struggle will not be about an actual formalized law of Jim Crow in the South. it is we're reaching a new stage of struggle, which requires the formation of a new democracy. Like, where it actually requires us to go beyond what we consider to be law, but what about the civilizational truths being upheld that are upholding laws now? Like, why is it that in the North there's no formal law that says if you're born black, you will get, like he said, like you will get twice of the bad and half of the good. It's for people. Like, it's not like there's a law put into New York City or a law put into Chicago or a law in Philly that's like, oh, look, on your birth certificate says you're black. That means you're gonna get half as much of the good, twice as much of the bad. He's like, that shows that there must be like an actual reconfiguration of what we call society itself. And that's, in some ways, we're in a moment, the fact that there is a lot of discourse around quote-unquote democracy shows something about the level of crisis in the country. Where, like, what you were saying about we in free school, we're entering a moment where it's so imperative that we talk about Du Bois clearly, we talk about King clearly, we talk about their theories of democracy. Because in some ways, like, you said this 2 weeks ago, where you were like, King, what he does that's significant is that the civil rights movement combines the universal human moral question with the political struggle, the necessity for political struggle, that unique combination of a moral like instinct, a moral imperative, and then the political democratic struggle is something that in some ways I feel like people in this moment are yearning for, but no one can talk about it clearly because they're not talking about King clearly. And it reminded me of what Lawson said. Like, I think Lawson said this thing where he was like, James Lawson said, we are citizens of a country that doesn't exist yet. He said something like that. And in some ways, he's also saying we must act like citizens. We must act like citizens responsible for a country that's not being let be born. And in doing so, we create that new country. We achieve that new nation. And yeah, anyways, I think I just wanted to start with that.
Yeah, because it reminded me of the interview that the Free School did with Lawson, and when you had asked the question of does nonviolence have a theory of the state that's kind of comparable with Lenin, for example, I found it interesting that Lawson brings up the Gandhian notion of parallel institutions.
Yes.
And actually, I was looking it up, and like there's this interview that Gandhi did where he said, a nonviolent revolution is not a program of quote unquote seizure of power. It is a program of transforming relationships that ends in a peaceful transfer of power. And he says, if under the impact of a foreign invasion or some such cause, if the ruling power abdicates and a vacuum is created, then the people's organizations will naturally take over its functions. And
King?
no, this is Gandhi, actually.
Oh, Gandhi. Okay.
Yeah, and so, but like, yeah, Lawson references it as the Gandhian notion of parallel institutions. And you can actually draw it more broadly as the Black freedom movement, the civil rights movement, was literally creating it was actually materializing a different form of democracy through the movement itself. And through the creation of what Lawson calls like parallel institutions, in which you can look at almost like as like the Black church as an example of a parallel institution, in which it's like, it's not, because I think what Gandhi's saying is like, it can't just be about, oh, like, yes, the people have to assume power, but it has to also be about like, how do the people gain the democratic capacity to govern themselves in the first place? And that's where I think Lawson was also interested in, was like, aside from the question of like literally the mechanics of how people take over power, it's like, how do the people gain the capacity to like govern a new society in the way that Emily said of like, how do ordinary people become citizens of a country that doesn't exist yet?
Right.
And in which there is like, also a situation that increasingly looks like there is essentially a vacuum of legitimacy. And like, we don't know exactly what the actual form it will take or when it will happen, but it's like the people have to be prepared to rule and to govern in the new society. And actually, yeah, it was interesting because I've been looking back at some stuff like Gracie Boggs was also talking about towards the end of her life when she was looking towards King too. And that's kind of how she talks about it, as like, and she had like her own kind of solutions, which I don't know if really are like capture the totality of what we're talking about. But I don't know. I just thought it was interesting because yeah, like Lawson, when you had raised that question, he really looks back to like what the civil rights movement was doing was, while, at least this is also my interpretation, while it was pushing for kind of the rights of liberal democracy, where the movement was like kind of moving towards and developing was kind of through the movement itself, you create new institutions, you create new governing, or like, I don't know, almost like a new social contract, which is necessary for the creation of a new state, a new democracy, a new society itself.
I think something that we're all getting to and which stood out in your presentation is also how you describe North Philadelphia, talking about North Philadelphia in human terms, because
Talking about North Philadelphia, what terms?
in human terms,
Mhm.
and to look at it in human terms, because when we study North Philadelphia and the factories and the industry that was present, it is a component of our study, but it's also not the full thing. And that Black Philadelphia was not defined solely as just workers, but also workers and leaders as part of a social system. These people that had a community that was both work, the church, and then also their neighbors. And the question is not just, or it's a very important question to understand the impacts of work for Black Philadelphia, but also the question is, what you're saying is that what happens afterwards is that the sense of dignity and life and aspirations that were taken out of that place. And that's different, because, or I guess the reason why I say that is because it also points to this crisis that you're saying. Is it just a crisis in economic terms, or is it a civilizational crisis as well? Like, what are men defined by? And because I think it also points to the imaginary that we've spoken to, which is, one, how do you see the crisis, but also the resolution? Do you see the resolution as just like simple mechanical fixes, or actually is it a crisis that requires actually a struggle by the people for ideas and for unity? And that's very different too from the readings that we've done of King, because King, in talking about the Montgomery bus boycott, is also saying is that the greatest achievement was the dignity of men and the belief that they are agents of change. And then in 1967, when he assesses that movement and also where it needs to go, he also emphasizes this concept of unity. What will bring the American people together? And because of that, it is this emphasis of what is it that unites men, and it is the moral question. But I guess it's also the question that also came up is is it that people want Medicare, or is it that people want Medicaid, or is it that people want life and a future for their children?
That's right.
Because I think when people talk about politics nowadays, it often becomes like, oh, are you a single issue voter? Or as in people just vote and aspire to one thing, or voting for one thing means your aspirations are that. Or are people's aspirations actually much broader and much more complete? Because I think what King is talking about, or what Baldwin talks about often too, is that there's something about American civilization that has poisoned the well of all human beings in the society, where people are unfulfilled, are isolated, are and so forth. And but
This is very interesting.
Well, I feel like when I was talking about this morning, when we were talking about King, and I was just thinking how King was able to sort of articulate the strivings of the people better than the people themselves knew how to articulate it. That's the overwhelming feeling that I got, is that there are issues, household or otherwise, of dignity and labor, but I think King used the language of faith and church, and the kind of language that the people understood, and sort of formulated. Like, when I read King, he uses so many allegories, right? He uses so many things like this is a very complicated structure of an institution, of government, and he breaks it down and says that this is what it actually means in like simple terms, and the people resonate with that and they understand him, and that's how he was sort of able to like unite such a large group of people together. And I think that is one of King's really great qualities, which I look at, which is, and I actually also see that in Gandhi. Both of these people reflect how to unite people using a language that they understand about their strivings. They have it, and he gives it a voice in a way. I was thinking about that when Alex was talking about it, but I did want to comment about this Ross Douthat podcast. One of the only kind of interesting things that I found, and people have mentioned this a little bit, is when Osita, first of all, I was listening to it on Spotify on my ear. I was not looking at the video at all. And I was like, this is a white man. I mean, I thought about it. I mean, that was the image that I had in my mind when I was just like hearing him. The only thing that I sort of suspected is because he had a deeper voice than most white men. And but I think the only interesting point that I came across in this thing is that when Ross Douthat is from selection a representation of democracy?
Of the democratic will.
Represent the will of the people.
The will of the people.
I remember he said that I don't believe in the will of the people.
No, he said, I don't use that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't believe, or I don't really consider it the will of the people. I believe in the rights of the people.
This is very interesting.
Right.
I think that was crucial. I mean, he says not the will, but the rights of the people, and to say that in such a to say that in this country really demonstrates how he's really disconnected from the democratic force of this country, which is black people. I think that saying that the rights take precedence over the will of the people is a political statement. I think it not entirely sure how to say this, but
No. You're hitting on something very important. Can I just say one thing? First of all, his theory is what we call an elite theory. So it's about how do the elites govern a rule. The other thing is the rights of the people. The question of rights rather than will of the people is a default to legal rights, to constitutional rights. So, and that is consistent with his notion of the of structural changes. So that's what I would say. I don't know that he really understood the consequences, but it was in the course of this discussion with Douthat that he got around the question of a mass democratic movement and prefers an elite change or reform in order to win back the people.
Because this is the last thing I think, and then
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Because I think that he was also trying to subvert the will of the people angle by saying that, well, you can have a majority for a particular issue, but that will not be the same majority for another issue. and hence the will of the people is an amorphous sort of
That's what he was saying.
concept which cannot really be pinpointed for anything, which is why we have to a more structurally sound thing to base democracy on is the rights instead of the will.
And see, this is the other. Oh, I'm sorry. No, this is very important because then it subverts the people demonstrating their will. And since you are not going to acknowledge that, you have to go to rights or law or process or structures. And this is, yeah. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I mean,
Speak up a little bit.
this is a different situation. Like, it seems like this guy, I didn't listen to the interview, but I want to now. I want to call him Osiris. He said, he's different than a person like Abraham
Candy. Yes.
in the way also that I don't know if people are situating him or he's situating himself. Because, and I wanted to bring that up in what you were saying, Doc, about how I don't know if he's trying to save the Democratic Party or trying to bring people into voting for the Democratic Party.
Absolutely.
Versus like a person like Abraham, where he was lifted up. Abraham was like put up or backed up by the university institution and money, like fund money, either private sector or, I don't even know how trust funds and as they relate to the university can get money all the time. But I wanted to bring that up because it seems like a different strategy that might anticipate the seizure of power, or like anticipate something that people would want to do, which is to seize power, or to, like, it's an anticipatory situation rather than like first of all, he doesn't come out of a vacuum or nowhere. So it seems like there's a different strategy that people are trying to think about as it, applies to the democracy or what people want this country to be.
This is very interesting. I too, okay, I just say this. I too was thinking about the trajectory, comparing his trajectory to Ibram Kendi's. When Kendi starts out, he's a similar age to what Osita is right now. But, and so they have not had enough time, neither of them, to think through any of these issues. So they're almost like reporting on a position or a consensus view of a part of the academic intellectual elite. And then they're put forward as representatives of that. And Kendi, well, Osita is democratic theory, Kendi is race theory. I think Osita does a better job on his side than Kendi does. There is an established social democratic theory of democracy. A lot of writing, a lot of theorizing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so Osita shows competence in knowing that argument. Beautiful thing. And I guess if you take enough graduate courses, you can learn that. And but Ibram Kendi is so out of sorts with race theory, which, by the way, might be a more rich area of debate and theory than democratic theory is. You know what I'm saying? There are hundreds of thousands of essays and books and lectures. When you get to race theory, it is like a say again?
No, I get kind of
Yeah.
what you mean.
Yeah. So Kendi seems to be out of sorts, out of touch with that. Any sociologist of race would see this guy, and there is no among academic sociologists and researchers. I don't know of any support for Kendi. No one would. I mean, I could get one or two, but they see him as a grifter, an opportunist, and so on. Osita does fall within a camp of academic theorizing about democracy, and he comes off to me as far more competent than Kendi. You listen to Kendi talk, he seems he can't answer questions, or it's I don't know. It's just so out of touch with the writings on race. You know, the idea that Kendi would say that black people are racist. I mean, now come on. Now even conservative writers like Thomas Sowell, I ain't never heard nobody say that or seen any writings on it. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, but are there actually ways to keep it consensus?
Yeah.
So, you think?
Or like, I mean,
So I don't think, but this is very, if I could, that's a very important point. If I might just, I can see, you're right about Osita. Yeah. Osita. I would agree with you that he is trying to build a consensus from the left of the Democratic Party. Okay. But I can't figure out what Kendi is doing, because there is no consensus that can be built around his writing. You just can't do it. Who are you going to? I mean, no one agrees with him. So he represented kind of a Hail Mary pass. Let's put this out there and see where it takes us, you know. But yeah.
Trying to manufacture a zeitgeist.
Yeah. But I think it's an absolute failure with Kendi.
Well, but like, especially with this movement, I feel like they're the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and like all of those intellectuals, they're trying to manufacture the sense of like, oh, there's a zeitgeist with Zoran, Bernie, the inheritors of Bernie, and Osita is now coming in as like trying to provide like a new, it's like, this is like, oh, like, this is where people are moving. And they're trying to, because I think one of the like core, we've talked about it before, but one of the ways that especially the Democratic Party legitimizes itself is by invoking the kind of appearance of a movement. And that's also because they are trying to.
Well, actually, I think that guys like Osita have gone beyond the Democratic Party. But go ahead. I don't think there's any base for them. Well, go ahead.
Well, because like, I mean, but I do think that Osita is trying to provide an intellectual and ideological kind of underpinning for what I feel like at least some parts of the Democratic Party still would be like, oh, this is the Zoran Mamdani moment or something. And like they're trying to manufacture the appearance of like, oh, this is our like real counter to Trumpism.
That's right.
Actually, it was kind of interesting that you brought up Ibram Kendi versus the function of Ibram Kendi in a certain moment versus the function of Osita, because and what you're building on, because it actually makes sense in some ways, because after
put it
Trump,
this way, a similar function.
or like the hope function.
Yes, the hope function.
Because after Trump's election, and you know how like there's that moment where everyone's like, oh, there's no future for the Democratic Party.
Right.
The people are like the base of the Democratic Party. It's not there anymore. Because like the Democratic Party was supposed to appeal to working people, and was supposed to appeal to working people and Black people, like and Latinos and the multiracial working class. base that actually ended up more numbers, more voting, either not voting or more voting for Trump.
Mhm.
And in some ways, I think it's because I feel like people are recognizing that the failure of the even Kendi approach to reinscribing the color line, or saying Trump is racist, Trump is fascist and racist and white supremacist, and the Democratic Party is anti-racist, it's all about the multiracial great society, blah, 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 FDR deal. And then, but then the election showed that that was not working. So in some ways, there's a need to go to this, to actually provide an intellectual, to actually have a real understanding of like, oh, actually we think billionaires are bad, and we believe in democracy. And it's their proposal of kind of a democratic vision where they've abandoned, I think, the even Kendi is an inspired force that doesn't function
A spent force,
a spent force. And in some ways, they're going for this guy. Because
Yeah.
an example would be like trade unions. Like my union, for example, they are looking for unions also do intellectual work in sociology. There's an actual assumption. They have assumptions behind why, like when they talk to the members, they're like, this is the vision for the future, and this is how we play a role. Like, right, that is what unions do. Like, they're not just a bunch of dum-dums, even though they are in reality kind of dum-dums. But like, they, in some ways, this exactly is some of whether they might, whether union leadership reads this guy or not, they're actually thinking the exact same way. But there has been a new directive from the top of the union echelon is saying we are going to target billionaires. We're going to say, actually, we're going to abandon the woke thing, and we're going to say that we're in defense of democracy. We're against billionaires. Billionaires are the ones ruining democracy, and Trump is a billionaire, and Trump is a reflection of billionaires. And like, yeah, they're actually, that is in real time a directive that we've gotten, which is like, the directive is, this is the new narrative. And
Yeah, the rhetorical.
Let's Paul, go
No, I
ahead.
just have a lot of thoughts on this. First of all, like I want to start by saying that the interview was very difficult for me to understand because I think there's also kind of, and I think this goes to what Emily Gemma, you were also saying is, it felt like an attempt at a new narrative that gives the Democratic Party or basically that coalition that aligns with the Democratic Party a standing ground at a time when all their efforts at building a new narrative is failing in some ways. And this is completely baseless. I have nothing to base this on, but in the way this guy was talking, I wouldn't be surprised if he makes a political run sometime
No.
in the near future. Really?
I don't think so. But anyway, you
Not
go.
charismatically.
Well, I mean, either I don't even mean like running directly for office, but being a vital part of a new kind of campaign, a new campaign that can be completely separated from all previous campaigns, including Bernie's and all of this. But it seemed very much a question of narratives. And the first thing I want to say is you said this and we've touched upon this, the complete absence of the question of Black people.
No question.
And I want to just also stress that I don't think it's just like a thing of forgetful or not giving it enough importance. I think it is very deliberate because if you're trying to talk about the question of democracy and democratic principles of reconstituting the state or reconstituting the structures, the political and economic structures, I don't see how you cannot deal with the Black question. And particularly, like, if all of this really is a response to Trump's election last November, I don't know how that factor that it was really the Democratic Party sort of like taking it for granted that Black people will bring us into office. And that was, I don't know, that expectation was so miserably handed a defeat. I don't know how this does not become a factor then in reimagining how you change political structures and voting and so on and so forth. Even if you thought that was the way democracy would be fixed, I don't see how you do not talk about the question of race. So I do not think it's just something that this guy like doesn't recognize or forgetfully, passes over. I think it is pretty deliberate to draw attention away from the fact that something massive is happening in this country, and it's happening at the level of people. And it's basically to obscure the observable evidence of what the Trump election showed, and the shift of the black vote in significant numbers towards the very unlikely direction of Trump. If we forget about all of the other demographics that voted for him, but that's one thing that I wanted to say, that it seems very deliberate, and then that also confirms to me that this is really a question of narratives. But then the other thing that I was thinking about also, and this is some of what I was thinking about, this thing of will of the people versus rights of the people a lot. Because we keep going back to it a lot in our discussions in preschool, this idea of governance being related to laying down laws or individual rights. Because even this thing of the electoral college, I mean, my main question after listening to 1 hour of that interview was that, what are you saying that is
1 hour.
Yeah, it's 1 hour.
Okay. So you listened to the whole thing.
I did. Late at night, that too. It wasn't very good. My main question was, and maybe this is just because I don't know, but my question was, what is it that you're saying that is new? This question of the electoral college being a problem, and the statehood and all of this debate has been going on for what, 100 years at this point?
Yeah.
And people have suggested different strategies. And what shocks me is that the time when they were talking most about how the electoral college basically F's up things in election was 2016, and then again in 2024. They didn't talk about it that much in 2020, right? So you are already biased even when you're trying to think about what is the proper just structures of the electoral process and so on. You are already biased because you prefer a certain outcome. You think it's a problem when Trump wins the electoral college vote, and not when Biden wins it. So then I don't know what you're saying that is new. And then again, this question of individual rights, which is basically to say that, if even this question of Puerto Rico or DC being given state representation at the level of the Senate, or I forget what the argument was, something like that, or bypassing the electoral college or something. I think you've basically, compared to the first 3/4 of your presentation where you were talking about the substance of democracy, what this guy was talking about was really the forms, the superficial features of democracy, which is that thing of representation of every individual's say or rights.
This is very important. And this, could I just see, there is the Anglo-Saxon theory of democracy and of the people, and it's known as the general will. Anglo-Saxon
General will.
Yeah.
I thought that was the French. Isn't that like Rousseau?
No. The French is the will of all. Rousseau and Voltaire. No. But that's the point I wanted to make. It's almost, this is why this general will and a democratic theory that defaults to the individual, which kind of goes along with an economic theory of the rational individual. You know what I'm saying? And Anglo-Saxon theory is always like that. It's Locke, it's Hobbes, it's Mill, John Stuart Mill, and everything going forward. Every assumption defaults to the individual. That's not king. It is the will of all, which is different than the aggregation of all individuals. It is something that precedes the individual as a citizen or member of society. It is a set of principles, a set of values, a civilizational predisposition. And that's why you cannot discuss these matters without raising then the civilization questions. in a Kingian way or Du Boisian way, so on and so forth,
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I don't know whether I made all the sense in
all the sense. Yeah,
I
that's.
think I'm right about that, Jerry. Check it out, man. I know you can.
I think you may have switched them.
I mean,
'Cause, I don't know. Yeah, I'm at.
yeah. Go ahead, man. When you find out, I'm sorry.
No, I mean, that's what I was saying is I think, yeah, the question of rights, it's an important question or whatever, but to talk about democracy simply from the perspective of individual rights and equal commensurate representation of individual rights, I think it takes you away from these very substantive questions that this country has to deal with. And I think you're also coming to a place where the people more and more are showing that they are willing to actually take this struggle up. And this is to some extent Ross Douthat's point, is that are we going to ignore that something happened with this election? Something changed, something about our understanding of
almost irreversible.
Irreversibly something changed. And he doesn't put it that strongly because I think he's traumatized by the first 6 months of Trump's presidency. But then the other thing is the entire framing of why these reforms are needed. The way he frames it is basically an answer to how do you stop authoritarianism, right? And it reminded me a lot about, like, this is why I agree completely that without Du Bois and King, it's almost like you're mid-sea and really like struggling to hold on to something that where you could still see the shore. Like, why did you even start thinking about these questions? Because Du Bois would say that the principal enemy of democracy is not authoritarianism, it's poverty. But in that entire
interesting. Go ahead, tease that out a little bit more.
I feel like you can gesture towards the question of poverty when you talk about the labor movement and giving more power to the working class and so on in very formal, I don't know, like formal ways. But then I think the question of poverty and then the special category of Black poverty is its own category that you cannot just like shove under the rug by talking about, oh, we are going to empower or workplace democracy and we are going to empower the working class.
But didn't King say that war also was
Yeah,
a threat? See,
yeah.
I would, if you would,
Okay.
and I know you're a busy woman these days, if you would do a deconstructive analysis of why I opposed the war in Vietnam, because I think that, among other places, is where he offers a critique of, quote, liberal democracy. I would, because you see, he does say poverty, but he says war, and he does say racism, these triple evils as he has it. But go, I don't want to.
No. I think the reason I was thinking about poverty, well, war is obviously
and racism,
something that never came up in that entire conversation.
No, and it won't.
And so you don't know what democracy, like, is it democracy that you like write down the specifics of, and you have laws and policies and so on, so everybody understands what you're talking about, but then how it actually affects people's lives is not something that ever becomes important. So who has why would we be willing to talk about democracy?
And see, and his assumption is that the changes in the, quote, structures of democratic governance will lead to a government that is more responsive to the needs of the people. Now the question is, well, what are the needs of the people?
What are the needs of the people?
Right. And you raise, okay.
Well, but that's all. I'm getting repetitive right now, but that's the thing, is the question of even this thing of, oh, the will of the people. This is not the right language. Rights of the people is the right language. Well, you can debate about what is the right language till the end of time, but then you still haven't done the essential work of actually getting to know what it is that the American people want, not just in terms of their individual rights, but a certain vision for what the country should stand for, what should be the values that are, and I agree, that is a civilizational question. And I think these people who are so busy constructing narratives are very, very opposed to the idea that there might be like a, a transition moment in America right now, where the civilizational question is actually, whether you use that language or not, is actually becoming important at the level of the people of the country. And the last thing I will say, this is a petty thing, but just to also like what bothers me or what irritates me about people who talk with a certain language is also this last part where they were talking about the mystique or mysticism and so on. And my question is, you're taking something that is as concrete as can be. You're talking about basically the lives and livelihoods of ordinary people, and then you have to make some kind of mythology around it, that it works in unexplainable ways, and
Like
it's
charisma.
charisma. And I mean, okay, like you can talk about King's charisma. I mean, you won't talk about King's charisma. You talk about Bernie Sanders and Trump's charisma, but there is something that is actually that's rooted and concrete, and I don't see why there is so much interest in trying to abstract these things and make it into a mystical process that cannot be like predicted or understood fully, and that just happens in like unfolds in untidy ways and so on. I think it is basically, the sense I get is it's basically like a refusal to admit or acknowledge that the people can actually like get organized, and they can get organized, and they can have, but yeah, this whole thing of, this is something I really like about democracy aesthetically, is it's the mystical nature of how it unfolds.
It's because you can almost see
I
someone.
think what he was saying by what they're trying to get at is the non-quantifiable dimension, which is that back to the thing. I'm just put the will of all versus the general will kind of question. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
Because you could see someone like Osita as a counterpart to someone like Curtis Yarvin or like Peter Thiel, in the sense that, because that's the subtext of why Ross Douthat asked the question, which is you have these people who are kind of attached themselves to the MAGA movement and are trying to then create a theory of monarchism based off of Trump, like the Trump moment. And so Douthat is asking, because people like Curtis Yarvin are saying that there's a mystique to monarchism. Like people like Curtis Yarvin, people like Peter Thiel.
Which one is Yarvin?
Yarvin's
calls him the king.
He's like a dark intellectual of the MAGA movement who's trying to say that Trump represents the need for monarchy in America, and he looks really
like the action.
So there's I think there's that wing, the kind of intellectual wing of the MAGA movement, or what it has attached itself to the MAGA movement, and they look really ugly too. But I think that's the reason why Douthat asked the question, which is that like those kinds of quote unquote conservative intellectuals say that there's a mystique to monarchy, there's a mystique to kings and queens and rulers and all that stuff. And so Osita is trying to say that there's also a mystique, a kind of aesthetic pull towards quote unquote, at least his version of liberal democracy. I don't know, like that was my reading of the kind of subtext.
No, what he was saying is, well, you get the British monarchy with the mystique. But American democracy is a more rough and tumble, discursive democracy, consensus building.
Yeah, I don't agree with the trivialization of Osita and his content, or the whole base thing, because one of us needs to be placed in. I'm from a English-speaking English colony, and any one of us could be in a situation like. I remember when we were doing the Pedagogy Worker Project, and Maggie set up a meeting with Nikhil Saval, who's a state senator in Pennsylvania, which is, what Purple was trying to say, his aspirations or something political like that. But I don't think it's trivial what he was saying in the conference of what he was saying by the issue of states, because it goes all the way back. I don't think what he was saying about civics is boring either, because it goes all the way back to the original founding of the Constitution, which is that America has always been a compromise between urban and rural communities, and this compromise, I'm just going to be repeating stuff we said in past speeches, but I think that it's important. But the crisis is also a constitutional crisis. And the idea of changing the way that senators are or getting rid of the House of Representatives is about redoing the compromise of the urban and the rural divide. But this goes back to the fields of all because I was watching TikTok, and there's a Western state senator who I don't know his name, but he was talking about how all the unions, when it came time to unite in Pittsburgh over things that were, their concern, that he felt backstabbed by the union leadership. And then when SEPTA PA, was a problem and he's not coming through for them, he said, well, tough luck, we left us on our own. And, everything that you said about deindustrialization, I was thinking about Detroit and how the city went bankrupt and, who knows mind with, the right governance. But, I think that, when you said that Osita was our age, I don't take it for granted that, I think the kids all like 5 years ago, we were just sitting having coffee. Now he's a CA state senator. Any one of us, through a chance of fate or the butterfly effect, could have been in his position and you should see that. But I did find interesting this time the contents of what he said about the Senate, Senator making America more democratic because, as you said, Doc, the main contradiction in this country is this deal that was made. Where I work is a CCRC retirement community, and most of the men there are millionaires, so it's cost a lot to stay there. And a lot of them are from the GI Bill, and a lot of them have been in the military, and then they became racist. And there's a judge there, and he was telling one of the employees, anytime I go to a restaurant in Philly, my bill gets paid. And now we don't have a GI Bill. I think that's the. But what Osita is talking about, this compromise that failed, just last year.
What compromise?
The rural, this team's been made and remade over and over again with, I'm trying not to go into a history lesson, but over Andrew Jackson.
And that's right, yes.
And, I was listening to NPR and they're talking about how Andrew Jackson was a great democratizer.
Yes.
He's demonized on the left because of what he did to Native Americans and his expansionism, but he was a great democratizer. But our social democrats, they're pro-imperialist when it comes time, but they are advocating democracy at home, which is what Osita is guilty of. To reform the democratic system so that continue to. But I just want to end by saying we talked about it was Wanda's thesis that would we rather have a world war or a civil war? And with the U.S. This constitutional crisis in Texas where the governor is trying to declare a quorum. The only time I heard of that was in House of Cards. That's a theme and it's a comical theme. But now, art is imitating real life, and we have House of Cards in real life. There's no other way to describe it. The point of the state, Senate, the rural divide, and SEPTA is this deal. That's why I don't think it's trivial to talk about a new deal, for Americans, because that's where it comes from. You have a raw deal, we're going to give you a new deal or a green new deal. But it is important to see, I guess that is the importance of, history, the third revolution, but also, the first revolution. I guess last year, and I can't watch that Hamilton movie by Lin-Manuel. I know that Hamilton is very, but I know that Hamilton is very important. His duel with Aaron Burr is very important. That was a struggle for the sigil. So the sigil, hyper-masculine honor struggle, but also something that could change the outcome of the state.
Well, this one. Well, okay. I was actually, there's been a lot on my mind so spurred by this discussion about the podcast, but also Dr. framing, and I feel like I'm just trying to maybe connect some of the threads that came up as everyone was speaking. But I guess maybe I'll start with like what you brought up, Samir, about like Lucia being, you know, actually in a very similar age group and actually sharing a lot of experiences with a lot of us at the table. And this is where I just wanted, like when I was listening, I was kind of curious, like who is this guy? Is he 40 or is he 30? Is he 50? But actually, the more I dug, the more I was like, actually, I kind of recognize somebody like him because he is in some ways like the son of a probably like Nigerian immigrant who has spent, and I found his CV / his LinkedIn, so everything is very clearly spelled out. But the thing is, he spent like we will look at this together this morning, like born around Arlington, like so DC, probably very near, very near like a lot of where African immigrants of a certain like I guess educated class settle, and then goes to University of Chicago. And completes a master's in public policy around like 2017 or something like that. And the only thing he's done since then is write for Slate, write for The Guardian, write for like
New York
New York Times, and like basically all he's done is write. And so that's where I was like thinking like maybe he might never ever like step into like do his own congressional run or something or like run, but like that kind of role will always be like this role of like being a commentator, political commentator, sort of like put a role in think tank, like all open to him, and like this podcast I feel like also is setting both his writing this book and then going on this podcast is I think like kind of like one step in this longer trajectory. But it's all like basically part of like a profile of people that I feel like you would have, I think each of us may have encountered at some point, whether we were at Penn or at Cornell, essentially like people who make a certain kind of career out of like this kind of level of like intellectual political science thinking. But it's kind of like when one time we were like, I remember we would kind of make sense of when Jamie Gauthier was first elected into City Hall, and some people asked like, well, the only thing she's really done after graduating from Penn is work at the Fairmount Park Arts Conservancy. Is that even a real job compared to Janie Blackwell, who spent all this time cultivating actual political experience with her husband in West Philly? But essentially I bring that up just because like I think it just made me think about like, like what like where he came from. That's why I listened to his name, like being of Igbo, origin and descent.
How did you find out he was Igbo?
I just looked up is Osita, what kind of name is Osita, and then what kind of last name is like what origins like does it come, and then there are other Nigerian Igbos named Osita, there are other Nigerians with his last name. But like
you can't find very much about his parents.
He's that young, that new, like But like actually it connected with something that you had said earlier in the framing, which I wanted to really there's a lot about your framing I really appreciated. One was also like I think Alice was bringing this up, like talking about more really in human terms, factories having biographies of their own, not because of this like postmodern thing of reading like specters and like blurring all these lines between like the human and the non-human, but it puts back on the table that like places like factories are where the aspirations, the souls, the actual human spirit of the Black proletariat coalesced and actually created something totally new. And that when we talk about like the ghost that continues to haunt North Philadelphia, of these empty shells of these factories, they must be understood, every one of them, the different types of factories. Like, I know that these sites like greet you wherever you go in North Philly, but also many, many other cities, towns, neighborhoods across America. And I think the way you talked about it was just really striking because it brought me up.
I just want to get your formulation, if you don't mind. Right before you got to the ghost, you talking about the human. How did you formulate that?
Well, I just want to say that there are a lot of like postmodernists that like, their whole writing is just going to random liminal spaces and talking about the layers of the past and the present and like, and the human and the non-human, and all they do is just meditate and just like, what's the word, like wax poetic about all of this, but they don't ever have a real point about what actually is important about a place, an institution, and like the Black proletariat, the ordinary working person. Whereas like we are able to, I think, actually articulate a real biography of the city, a real biography of North Philadelphia through our anchorage in the Black proletariat. Like we're not using all of this very lightly, basically. We're not talking about this in a, flippant kind of academic way. We really mean it when we are conducting the study, the sociological study, that we want to see like North Philadelphia through the eyes of the Black proletariat. And like that brings me to what I was going to say next, which was what the part that also really moved me was also when you talked about dreams deferred and dreams deferred, like the Langston Hughes poem. And I remember actually King referenced that poem with a speech either called like Unfulfilled Hopes or Unfulfilled Dreams. Shattered Dreams. Yeah, and what was really moving was when you said that, like, well, it was very moving altogether, but basically it's like there's the generation of children coming up now in, say, North Philly, may even know how to dream because their parents or grandparents may not have passed on, like what it means, their dreams. But, and then you follow that by saying, but there will always be dreamers. And I feel like there will always be dreamers and people who, in the search, like will not give up the search essentially for truth and beauty and freedom and for Black gods. And and that's sort of the flip side that I'm always interested in when we talk about art in the search for Black gods, or the notion that a lot of these artists, like, I mean, today I like gave you a copy of my pieces because I felt like actually, yeah, Barbara also someone who's always like, she's always talking about her vision, her dreams, and like what it meant to grow up in Strawberry Mansion essentially. But like people who, despite all the churches like selling out and like traditional avenues that people have, maybe not even traditional, like, institutions that could have been counted upon during Kingstown to be a home or like a place to cultivate these aspirations or this search for Black gods. And like that being an option really closed off for a lot of, especially young people. Can art continue, and music and dance and theater continue to be a place where, on principled terms, not on, unprincipled terms, continue to be a site for the search and this investigation? I'm not sure, but it is something I feel like we're very interested in. But what you said about, like your language of invoking like the Langston Hughes poem is also just really striking to me because it's just not something that I'm very certain, like, no, I'm not certain that there would be, if say we're used in say a New York Times podcast or like, it just would sound very false or like it would fall very flat, but at the same time, they have their language, they have their way of seeing the world. But how is it that the people are, actually conceiving of this crisis? How is it that they are perceiving like the depths of this crisis, but also how is it that they will continue to dream or continue to, think of the way forward or, how they resist. But the last thing, I think I skipped over this earlier, but this is not really as related to what I was just saying, but what I was really struck by as well from the framing was basically how it never came up in that podcast, like the elite capture of the state, through this, and you pinpointed at the 60s. And I was really hoping that the podcast would bring up like, where did things go wrong between the state and the people? And like, why is this big gulf? And like, no, it didn't just start in like 2015 with Trump. You have to go all the way back to 1960s and these brutal assassinations of not only like the actual president of the United States, but someone like King. Like, why didn't that come up when they talked about like what happened to, did democracy die in darkness? Maybe not, but maybe it did die a little. But it did die quite a bit when King was assassinated, Malcolm X, and Charlie King. And I really appreciate that. That's where like basically this like history. In some ways, it is also a history of consciousness too, the way you laid it out in your framing. That was just so, when you just compare your framing to the podcast, it just feels so incredibly, you use the word like adolescent or juvenile, but it falls incredibly flat for me. Like how, I guess, like basic, or like I was also thinking of civics class, like in high school, when I was just, because they invoked that in the podcast, and how, the idea of like, having presenting this sort of like 101 style, or even like is democracy, made up of all these structures, or is it made up of people? Like, these are questions I think you pose to like high school students to allow them as they turn 18 to start like considering what it means to like take a vote for the first time and start thinking of themselves as like, members of a society of citizens. But you don't continue basing your entire like trajectory or your analysis, the way maybe a student does, on these same questions of like, like California is underproportionately represented by my. These are the things I feel like my high school teacher was just like, well, just think about how, like, just think about it as if like, they're just prompts for young people, for me at least, like to think about these issues. But the real, the real questions really emerge when you take up the second American Revolution with like Reconstruction, the attempt to create a new kind of democracy, like the actually most democratic part of this country, from the least democratic part of this country, through the dictatorship of the Black proletariat. The real questions really begin when you start to, find the ways in which a king and the civil rights movement framed this question around the incomplete freedoms and the incomplete struggle for making not just liberal democracy real, but genuine people's democracy real in this country, and how they, framed all their work that way, and like framed it in human and nonviolent terms, and also this question that we're talking about that came up in the Lawson interview, through governance, and like, but also how brutally that was taken as if it was just this message, again, through the assassinations, through the counter-revolution, and through what you were talking about, like, incarceration, deindustrialization, drugs, now even more so with cognitive manipulation, gun violence, all of this, like, as if to say none of that thrust for, a genuine people's democracy, like the possibility of the birth of a new nation, is actually worth taking up, or like that's precisely what was wrong, or like must be punished for. And I feel like that's where I feel like it's just so evident to me that like we have actually made such a real effort, and the people are like want to make a real effort to understand like all of these questions and want to do something about it. And that's how I felt when I put all these pieces together. There are other thoughts, but
why don't you present them?
it's a
Time.
But can I ask you a question that connects to your last point? Because actually, what Kathy was saying is something I was thinking about. What you began with, the recapture of the state, because that's a new. In some ways, you were saying that it's historically distinct. Like it's not like we're saying, for example, since 1776, there's been an elite state, like a state of the. You know what I mean? So. Because in some ways, I was trying to figure out a connection. It's kind of like a long question that connects into things, but what Kathy was pointing out about like the elite capture of the state, and you were like, why didn't the interview? In some ways, you were instinctively feeling, why is the interview not talking about the elite capture of the state in relationship to like democracy, but essentially like even the difference between the right, what more important or being misunderstood, the rights of the people or the will of the people? And I guess it's more of a question, a political theory question, because this is related to what you're saying about Andrew Jackson being a democratizer or the New Deal, because in some ways there's definition, the reason why those, even if Biden is like, I'm a New Deal Democrat, or even if Trump's like, I'm just actually trying to do something New Deal-ish, it doesn't fit anymore, because the crisis is not a crisis. It's not even a crisis of the Great Depression, but it's like a crisis of the form of democracy itself. So I guess my long question is it that is the point that Shantanu brought up in the interview of the difference between how people are talking about is the rights of the people being infringed, and does that have to be protected, versus the will of the people? Is so in some ways, like, is it also that because of the elite capture of the state, the rights of the people, technically we all still have legally protected rights, we
Yeah.
go into that, but the real thing being infringed upon is the will of the people. Or I guess I'm just trying to piece together like when you said there's an elite capture of the state, and because of the elite capture of the state, the people are, and now we're at a time where the people increasingly are actively distancing themselves from the institution of the state, because, and hence the elite no longer can democratically rule over the people who are like, F all y'all, like I'm opting out of the system because I don't trust you. And there's a crisis of legitimacy. Is that to say that there's no longer the elite can no longer rule democratically because of the people's will? So even though the people have rights, that what matters is the people's will, and that actually, if anything, you could kind of see the way the people are, whether they're vote for Trump or whether they don't vote at all, as rejection. Them rejecting the value of bourgeois freedom or individual rights in favor of a hope for society freedom.
Yeah, let me just clarify something. The concept of elite capture is not my concept. It has a certain life in political and theoretical discussion. I should have been more precise. It was captured by a certain wing of the elites. That's why they had to kill Kennedy, to nullify that wing of elite governance. So you eliminate that, and then with King you eliminate the popular democratic movement. So with these assassinations, objectively, you have cut off a pathway to democracy, and that part of the elite who would be more willing to compromise with a democratic movement. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The United States then becomes that, and that constituted a coup. Not just with one act, but with several acts within the course of a few years. The consolidation of power, the elimination of opposition, which then makes possible all that we have seen since, including the war in Vietnam, which was lost, which was then a moment where the elites, now that had taken power, have to reconsider and reconfigure. And they do. A lot of that had to do with, quote, reforming the Democratic Party and eliminating what we would call the progressive. The progressives are generally associated with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal type of people. You eliminate progressives, and liberals aligned with progressives, and the Democratic Party is remade in the image of Bill Clinton. And so this is as far away from the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt as you can imagine. But this is a multi-decade struggle to seize power, to capture power, and then to reform or reconfigure institutions of state and government power, ending up by the people feeling they don't count, and then they stop voting. And this is not just at the level of the federal government, but in some ways where people have their most regular or consistent interaction with government, that's at the local level. So here in Philadelphia, we have a mayor, a black mayor, who busts a black union and considers it a victory and is proud of it. You know what I'm saying? Which means that she is the mayor not of the people, but the mayor of that ruling elite. So that's what I was getting at with that capture. Now, I said it is comparable to a coup d'etat. You could say a moving coup d'etat. And of course, this is the other thing. You must get the submission of the media and of the intelligentsia. And that's why we talk about this 30-something-year-old, and as you said, Sarah, Kendi and him, they're young. Too young to know very much. Too young to have all of this cultural capital invested in them. Too young. You haven't done anything. Nobody knows you. And your thinking is just, either so imitative of something else or just totally out to lunch that you wonder, how do such people arrive at these positions? And you have to say that they are representatives or speak on behalf of larger, more powerful networks of power. The other thing I wanted to say, I just want to get to disintegration of the state, as a historically constituted process. But before I got to that, I wanted to.
Will of the people, right?
No, I didn't want to go to will of the people yet. See, state power is an art and a science. You first of all, in a democracy like this, which is not that democratic because so much of it is based upon the passivity of the people, which means that they imbibe rather than act. I take in narratives. Take, for example, MSNBC. 24/7 of, quote, discourse, but all saying the same thing with different talking heads. So the role of ideas or propaganda is very significant in the maintenance of state power, where you don't have power, but you can be an observer of power. You know what I'm saying? You're not in the debate, but you observe the debate. You know what I'm saying? And so your passion is not so much what's happening politically, but whether or not the Eagles will win the Super Bowl again. It is a transference from substantive political questions and the reduction of the citizen to a childlike state, who is more interested in games and playing and fashion and, eyelashes and fingernails than in the substance of life. They do not participate in life. So you have this convergence, and this is your point, which I agree with wholly. Once you take the moral imperative out of questions of rule and politics and governance, then what you're saying is none of that concerns me. What concerns me is the 76ers. You know what I'm saying? And there's nothing worse than a fan of professional sports. That is a person who is just, really has become a grotesque imitation of a human being. It's so sad to see. And these grown men reduced to this. So the question of the state and state powers, art and science, you need the intellectual, but also you need the person who studies communication and propaganda and manipulation. And then frankly, and this is a part of the problem we face right now, is that a significant part of the populace has been reduced so far that they don't know how to respond. They have no skills of thought, of thinking, of critical thinking. Now, this is why I'll just end here, to look to that part of the population, we'll just use that language, that still has a sense of opposition and a memory of resistance that is a part of their cultural DNA. And there's only one group that has that, and that's Black people. That does not mean the movement will be only Black people, but to stabilize it, to anchor it, to unite it. I mean, if you ask the question, and believe me, this is not anti-white at all, but on what grounds would white people form unity? Or they never have. It's only been temporary. Unions have been busted. That was a source of some coming together. They have been, in some ways, culturally defeated. And even though they can have these uprisings, they are more or less passive. And this is bold when white people are going to have to find a way to abandon whiteness. That identity puts them against Black people, reduces them to rank individualists, and fictionalizes their very being, their very existence. You know? So the American dream is a white dream. And this wet dream, a white dream. That's why you get a cat like Trump. His appeal is very thin. You know, and that's why he has to perform. That's why he has to, in some ways it's a political strategy, draw attention to himself. So the front page of the New York Times or Washington Post is all Trump. Trump did this, Trump said that, he put, you know. But that's a political strategy. But then when he goes to meet with Putin, you got to bow down. Act like you know. Act like you as dumb as you really are. You know what I'm saying? But to draw attention is a political strategy. To create a fiction of a president. Well, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I just want to clarify what I said earlier about bringing up Hamilton and Henry Clay and the compromise. So I was trying to talk about what we were talking about in preschool back in 2016, and Arthur Schlesinger and the Center. And
the Vital Center, very important. Yes.
That's what I was trying to talk about, and why the small state, big state was the Vital Center. But
say that one more time.
The small state, big state divide
on the question of the Vital Center.
Rural, urban. Don't distract me. Hold on, I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to clarify. The importance of me bringing up Hamilton and what the thought that was. We're talking about Madisonian democracy, what Noam Chomsky talked about. Known Madisonian democracy versus Jeffersonian democracy, and what Jefferson meant of the Constitution versus Madison's elite taste of that. That was my interpretation. But the importance of bringing up white leadership and their compromises was.
But could I ask you to just do? I mean, I hate to interrupt. Could you return to that Vital Center question? Yes. This is hugely important, and I'm glad you remember that, man, because it wasn't. Okay, I'm sorry. Forgive me.
No, I promise.
No, I'm wrong. My bad.
the importance of bringing up those white leaders back when white people did have leaders to make those kinds of compromises is that when the crisis did become too much for the nation, it was Black people who came to renew the promise, come back to the table, and remake the nation, as we say. Now we were talking about a time today where there's no real left, but a social democrat, fake left, synthetic left, whatever you want to call it, and there's no Black movement to save it or reclaim it. And that's the question today: is what's the capacity of Black people to come in and remake the nation when it looks like the cracks are back
in the face of regime collapse? Absolutely.
And with the elite takeover, will there be?
That's right.
Will there be?
Go ahead.
No,
it's very
what
interesting.
What was it all about? Will the experiment? I'm kind of sad because this is what Juneteenth is about, and this goes back to Henry Winston about Americans being anti-state or the Enlightenment, being critical of the state, who the state, and the state and the individual. I just goes to your question of the will of the people versus the rights of the people. I don't know.
See, can I just say this question of the Arthur Schlesinger?
Or needs and the collapse.
The question, first of all, the theory of a vital center, which means that you govern from the center. Two huge political constituency who fight it out in election, and then when it comes to governance, you compromise. It is, and it's interesting that Arthur Schlesinger came up with this theory around the same time that we entered this decade of assassinations. But still, what's left of the ruling elite, because the section was eliminated through assassination and marginalization and intimidation, what is left then goes back to the rules of party politics and governance, which is the vital center. But now, and this is what, and what's his name? Osita doesn't, well, it's part of not knowing enough. You just don't, you sound good, but that's it, What happens? And can the ruling class rule in a time when the country is so divided, where the center has not held? And that's a poem by The Second Coming. Yeats. Yates. The Second Coming, where he says the center will not hold. Things fall apart. That was in 1919. And this is a hugely significant question. And this is a question of state theory. I mean, just of democracy. What happens when the center has not held? And this, we well into a couple of decades now, at least a decade and a half, where the center has not held.
Well, I wanted to, I guess, connect it to Emily's question about...
And Kathy, I want you to say the things that you felt you didn't have time to say. Okay, go to the question. Okay.
Well, just, with Emily's question about the will of the people, and how it connects to what we're talking about, because actually, in a way, you can look at Du Bois as similar in some ways to almost like Rousseau, in the sense that...
Absolutely, I agree with that.
Rousseau's idea of the will of the people is not, like you said, the numerical amount.
I think the will of all.
I think it's because will of all is the amalgamation. Rousseau's general will is when people act not just in the interest of themselves, but the interest of the people.
Absolutely.
And actually, Du Bois says it in a different way in this essay, The Revelation of Saint Orgné, The Damned, which is one of his ways of working out his theory of democracy through this allegory of a black saint moving through history, all that stuff. But so Du Bois says, the citizen of a democracy who thinks of democratic government chiefly as a means of his own advancement, meets and ought to meet disappointment, insofar as the citizen conceives of democracy as the only way to advance the interests of the mass of people, even when those interests conflict with his own interests, then he is playing the role of a patriot. And so Du Bois says democracy does not and cannot mean freedom, but I think he's meaning freedom as like the English idea of like liberty. So on the contrary, democracy must mean coercion. It means the submission of the individual will to the general will, and it is justified in this compulsion only if the will is general and not the will of a special privilege. And I wanted to bring that up because like I think it's also like what do in the general mass of people, what do the American people feel is undemocratic about American society? One, that power is controlled by so few people, and the way that it's controlled is so shadowy and opaque, and so far removed from literally anyone's real concept of like how a democratic society should govern. But it's also the actual cost of what we say the cost of empire, which is everyone feels to different degrees, and this is literally what Trump represents, that so America is governed not for the interests of the people, but is governed for the interests of an empire. And this is what Trump represents, which is like when Trump is like, your country has been taken from you, you can interpret that both in a racist way, but also in like an actual practical way, which is that Americans feel that their government is ruled for the interests, not just of a handful of elites, but for the interests of maintaining an empire, which is literally the grossest violation of anyone's practical sense of democracy. And I think what Du Bois and what King are working out is, especially now, which I think it makes it more pressing, what you said, in which it's almost like the will of the people, especially today, has been so corrupted and so pacified and made it so hard for people to actually come together and even express what a democratic will of the people should be. The only way that you can change that and to create a new will of the people, a new general will, is through a mass people's movement. And that's also why actually like one of my interpretations of Black Reconstruction is that when Du Bois uses that term abolition democracy, he's not using democracy in a negative way, just as only meaning the abolition of slavery, but he's also using it, this is my interpretation, as a gesture towards a new democratic movement, which emerges out of the anti-slavery movement. And in a similar way, you can look at the Third American Revolution in a similar way, where it's like this new idea of democracy, a new concept of democracy is literally created through the course of a people's movement and through the course of the creation of a new consciousness, a new will, in which it's like, the default in American society is because of white supremacy. White people are trained to only think of democracy in terms of advancing my personal interests. And the only way you can change that is through a mass people's movement, in which your sense of even what democracy is and what it's for has to be transformed through the course of a people's movement. And I think, I don't know, that's just like I was trying to go back to like things that I was also thinking about earlier, but I think, that's kind of my, I guess, concept.
And that's a different democratic theorizing. You say that democracy arises with a new consensus, a new unity, a new discourse. And that's
and you can even see it, like, however limited and wayward like the Trump movement is, in a way, despite all those limitations which we talked about, you can also see it though, because Trump's claim is that I am the movement, I am this mass movement. But you already see signs of however limited and however confused it is. People, I think, in the MAGA movement are straining. They don't have any guidance of like where they should go. But like you can even see on this whole thing of Israel, there are huge parts, I think, of the MAGA base which are moving beyond Trump on this whole Israel question. And it's crystallized by people like Tucker and Candace. But it's like
and Marjorie
Taylor Greene. But like there's already this straining of like, whatever Trump helped to set into motion in 2016, that, and however, whatever limitations and weaknesses there are of the Trump movement, the MAGA movement, it's like you already see, like, because it is a movement and people conceive of, like, and I feel like we also sensed this when we went to like the Trump rally in North Philly during the election. It's like people have a sense of themselves of like, I am part of a movement, And the condition for that is that our consciousness is changing, even if we don't know where it's going towards. And even if we are basically almost like rejecting the one solution or the one beam of light which would allow us to find the way forward, which is King in the civil rights movement. Even in the midst of that, it's like you're still seeing this, like literally what is the result of a mass, like however limited it is, a mass movement, which is like it has to go beyond whatever Trump represents. And and like you can see, like signs of it and spurts of it. Yeah.
I was also thinking about what Emily had said earlier on in the conversation, which is that there's a need to fuse the moral instinct and the moral imperative, like with the political struggle. The moral instinct and the moral imperative with the political struggle. And I feel like part of the deficiency or the inadequacy of somebody like Rosita or like the whole elite like premise of what democracy is that it's like gamified or like kind of cynical. It's like, oh, how can we win votes? How can we win back people?
Yeah.
And it's not about really having like a moral mandate. It's really just like, how can we narratively like pitch Medicaid in like a sexier way so people feel more convinced? And I feel like that's also basically like a form of almost like ideological, like political manipulation to win political power. And I feel like in some ways, because King was like such a perfect crystallization of like, yes, the moral instinct, but then fused it with like actual political struggle when he talks about like the total participation of human beings in like transforming American society. I feel like in some ways the assassination of King was meant to basically like split the two things again, where you've had like for 60 years like politics without moral instinct, like just political struggle, just like these two parties like battling for like some kind of. But I feel like then now what you see with the crisis of legitimacy, or every time we say that the center cannot hold, it's that there's the center, like the moral center of society has like basically fallen out. And we had talked about this like a few months ago too, where when we were sort of assessing Trump, all of the truthful and important things that he says about like basically revealing the cost of empire, like the cost of deindustrialization, all of these things, despite that Trump can't provide a moral center for like basically the movement or like where it needs to go. And I was kind of thinking about it too, like in relation to Black God and the need to basically rediscover Black gods, because I think Black gods is basically like the concept that I think can furnish like a new moral center for society. Because I was also thinking about like Trump and white gods and stuff like that. But I feel like our task or what we're saying is that we need to like fuse together again this like moral imperative and political struggle, and that's what we mean by democracy. It's not like it's not about Puerto Rico or like changing the Senate. It's about like is there actually like a moral
It would be easier if it was just because actually, you know who the OC really reminds me of? Like, I was like, oh, I should send this to my dad because he would love this. And I was like, actually, I think he would love it.
Why would he love it?
Because he always talks about, he actually instinctively, like a year ago, he was like, oh, the real reason why we couldn't prevent Trump from winning is if we change the electoral college, or like, oh, we could change representation. And it's kind of a part of it, what Mary was saying was the real question is one of responsibility. It's not about how the structure is wrong or the system, the voting system is wrong. It's really a question of.
May I ask you a question? Why do you think your father would resonate with Osita?
Because he literally talks about the stuff where he's like, the Senate, the reason why we have Trump is like, we need to change. If we balance the Senate, we added certain seats, or if we like got rid of the electoral college and only had the popular vote, then like we wouldn't have had Trump.
See, what I wanted to ask you, does he proceed from certain assumptions, and what are they? And why would a person from China so readily accept kind of a liberal dogma? I mean, you don't have to answer it. Maybe you don't know.
I think the argument for the electoral college that was raised a lot in 2016. That's less popular right now because Trump also won the popular vote. And I don't know how they're trying to make this into a bigger deal than it is. But I wanted to actually go back to what you were talking about in terms of rights versus the will. And I think during this conversation, I've been thinking more and more about what those rights are. And as you said, they're, it's- they're the kind of rights that the state can possibly guarantee. And I guess as an American citizen, you have the right to free speech, to follow your own religion, the right to bear arms, the right to privacy, and others. But then I was thinking, what about the right to work or the right to, uh, you know, self-determination, health, housing, all of these that impact the daily lives of people? Those are not considered quote-unquote rights.
But this is king. Rights that are neither given nor taken away by the state. Remember, he says that there are rights. And this is the moral question of who is the human being. And does the state bring into existence the human being, or do human beings bring into existence the state? And therefore, the people have a right and an obligation to change the state when the state violates rights that it has not given, but yet it's going to take them away. You remember, does anybody remember that speech where King eloquently talks about there are certain rights that are neither given by the state? You remember that? Okay, I'm sorry, but go ahead.
No, because one of the things that came to my mind when I was pondering this question about the will and rights is that how King has fundamentally changed this question for us. Because if I apply the same thing to say the Israel-Palestine conflict, should I say that the will of the Israeli people should supersede the Palestinian right to self-determination to live? I can't agree with that. I can't morally agree with that. But I feel like their state is fundamentally unchanged. It's a part of empire that has not really taken in what, the transformation that has happened in America and what can possibly affect them in the future. And there was a David Brooks article that came out last week about, it's called America's New Segregation, which I found really interesting. The first 3 paragraphs was basically an ad for the NGO that he works in. The first 3 paragraphs. But then I think he makes an interesting point, which is that we have been brought up knowing that Jim Crow was a violation of human rights, that Jim Crow was this rancid policy. And now we have successfully recreated this along class lines. And I thought it was interesting because he touches upon all of these avenues of crisis that we were talking about during the time that during your framing. Because even though he doesn't like Trump, he's against populist movements. But I think the major thing I took out of that article was how he was trying to recognize what the problem with the Democrats really was.
Letter from a Birmingham Joe. I'm sorry. Yes.
And just one thing I want to read out here from that article, which is he says, "So you may want to stand up and be part of the resistance to Trump. More power to you. I myself have called for this. But let us be clear that resistance is treating the symptom, not the ailment. The ailment is the tide of global populism that has been rising across the developed world for years, if not decades. And the cause is that our societies have segregated into caste systems in which almost all the opportunity, respect, and power is concentrated within the educated caste, and a large portion of the working class understandably wants to burn it all down." And so I think he is sort of touching on crisis of governance and legitimacy, the crisis of civilization and morality, and science and education, where he's trying to say that, you know, these elite educated people, the elite capture of this, and the elite capture of the state by these educated group of people have separated them so much from the working class. They don't find out what their aspirations are, what their strivings are, and he is attributing that to the failure of the Democratic Party and its continued failure of the Democratic Party, its inability to have predicted or had a chance to defeat something like Donald Trump and his populist movement. And I think what I take from that is that the Democrats have failed, right? But I also think that the kind of movement that MAGA is, like Jeremiah was saying, I think it doesn't know where it's headed. It doesn't know where it's going, which is why I think we were talking about this yesterday, and Gahan brought it up, that we are at the stage of the struggle where we're still gathering a lot of information. We're still gathering information about the ideological lines that this struggle will continue on. It's because if you don't know where you're going, you will end up with something like Trump, which is a legitimate movement, I have to admit, because it is democratically constituted. But again, it's misguided, I would say.
Maybe we should.
No, I mean,
It's
I didn't find the exact.
it's from King's letter from a Birmingham jail, and it is more similar to Rousseau. The preconditions for a state, precondition, or like we were saying, the moral preconditions to govern. Which recognizes the human being, and that King saw them as God-given rights. They came from God, came from the fact that we are all created in the image of God, yada, yada, yada. I think that is very important to understanding the task of reconstituting the state upon democratic principles, more than democratic principles, but practices. It has to recognize the human being. And this is what is so important. The human being cannot be fully recognized until Black people are recognized. There cannot be secure human rights in this country until Black people have them and are recognized. I see everybody's getting a little exhausted. So, are we having a chat?
Yeah, sure. Michelle, Bumbleye, I'm Scott. So good morning. Kia Pierce had some comments about like there's hidden and not so hidden racism.
Say that again.
Just that there's hidden and then also not so hidden racism. Someone named President Jesus said the bourgeoisie is always looking for the next Jamel Bowie. And then Jahan said, I listened to 2 podcasts. Not a single word about war or foreign policy. He prioritized the trans struggle over Black people. It's interesting that Schlesinger's first book was about the age of Jackson, written out of the experience of the New Deal in 1946. The ruling class does not have intellectuals of that caliber. It's interesting that intellectuals like Osito are tailing the political actions of the people. They're trying to get ahead of them, but seem to be hardly keeping up. And then BK was talking about, I think what you had said about King and letter from a Birmingham jail, that there are natural God-given rights versus civil rights, which are benefits and privileges. Where civil rights of man are derivative of natural, unalienable rights endowed by the Creator. That's all.
Well, I guess it's time to say goodbye.
Yeah. I think we'll continue the conversation next week on democracy. But, right, bye everybody.